Okay. Okay. Right. Yeah, I'll be. Just only Pakalo, you can.
In several crises in the last 8 to 10 years. They recently signed a new agreement with the IMF. They also restructure their debt with the markets, I think for the 21st or 22nd time. I mean, Pablo is maybe correcting me, but it's on the 20s. And also this is the 23rd program with the IMF. So in a way, we have gathered a set of panels to discuss monetary options on how to stabilize Argentina, and a final panel on broader strategies for reform and stabilization in Argentina. So with that, I'll turn it to Frank Vela, who is the Ed Villani Chair of Economics here at Georgetown, to introduce the first panel and to moderate the first panel.
Thanks, Alejandro. So let me welcome everybody here on behalf of Alejandro Center and also Georgetown Center for Economic Research and Georgetown and Economics Department, and also Georgetown University in general. Before I start, I should just mean Alejandro's been like has been an extraordinary addition to the Georgetown community, and he's comprised a number of panels and had a number of events, all of them being extremely interesting and I think on always extremely important topics. So Alejandro, thanks for all the work you're doing. I think you're bringing a lot of attention to to some very important issues. So as Alejandro said, I'm going to, I think moderate's been a bit too generous. What I'm going to do is be the chair of the session. So we're going to have a speaker, then Emilio's going to speak in a moment, and then we're going to have two discussants. Let me just give a very brief introduction about Emilio. He's the professor of finance and economic history at the Universidad de Cima, and it's director of Center for the Study of Economic History. He was an adjunct professor at Stern, and he's also been a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an author and editor of 10 books in history of economics, and lectured on a number of topics in Argentina and abroad. He has a book which has a Spanish title, so I'll let you pronounce it out of respect. I welcome you to give your presentation, and you have 20 minutes. And
thank you
I'll try to remind you if it's necessary. Thank you
very much.
Great. Well, first of all, I have to thank this Georgetown Americas Institute for organizing this event about Argentina, which is always in the same sort of trap, trying to get out of inflation and avoiding another crisis. And particularly to Alejandro Werner, who invited me to participate, and to all of you for coming. Alejandro has given me 20 minutes to talk about dollarization. I recently published a book that has 400 pages. And so what I've been asked to do is to summarize in 20 minutes 400 pages. It's a tall order, but I have to do it because I'll be kicked out of dinner otherwise. So, so let me start by just simply focusing on three questions. When it comes to dollarization, there are basically three questions. Why, how, and when, okay? And let's start with the why. And before I give you my answer, I want to preface this by pointing out certain things about Argentina that I think are very important when we consider different options to stabilize the economy. The first is that populism, which is endemic in Argentina, has pushed us into what economists call a second best. So we're in a clearly suboptimal situation. We have 10 years of stagflation in Argentina with deep structural imbalances and also macro imbalances. So we have a serious problem, economy that hasn't grown in over 10 years. And it's my belief that price stability today is not an option with the national currency. I don't think we can achieve this because as an independent central bank in Argentina is an institutional utopia. The planning horizon for policymakers in Argentina is too short. The political system has built-in incentives to overspend, but not only to overspend, but to do it procyclically and very inefficiently. And we have something that is called institutional anomie. Institutional anomie is when your government actually does not obey the laws, does not comply with the laws, because either they have a submissive legislature and a submissive judiciary, so they can avoid the consequences of not complying with the law. And sometimes they change the law very quickly. So the same people who today would approve a law, tomorrow, those same legislators will give you the opposite arguments to amend it or to basically eliminate it altogether. So we basically don't have a mechanism, an institutional mechanism to solve what is called the commitment problem. How do we ensure that somebody who says they're going to reform the economy, they actually do it? And the other problem we have to top this list is that we have had a cycle, a stop-go cycle of reforms. So we start with reforms, we never manage to complete these reforms, and then a new government comes in that completely reverses everything, and that actually accelerates economic decline. And I want to take the time, because one of the courses I teach in Argentina is economic history, to basically do a brief recap of some truths about Argentina I think is very important. The first of all is that the cycles of high, volatile, persistent inflation in Argentina are related to an excessive level of government spending that Argentine society does not want to finance voluntarily. So that's the first fact. So when we look at a solution, clearly spending is the issue, more than the deficit, Sometimes we're too focused on the deficit. The problem in Argentina is the level of spending. The second issue that is very important to remember as we analyze options for Argentina is that Argentina has a very vulnerable economy. And the reason it's very vulnerable is it's very closed. It's highly dependent on commodity exports that are volatile to generate foreign exchange. And to top it all, it has a public sector that has a massive currency mismatch. Essentially, we have a public sector that gets pesos in revenues and they have to pay dollars for the debt they owe. And with this kind of system, the banking system, we have a banking system like most countries, a fractional reserve banking system, but this banking system is captive to deficit financing. And it's impossible to achieve financial stability with this kind of system. There's no foreign exchange regime that will survive without a crisis, without default, or without hyperinflation. And finally, which is particularly relevant to what we're going to discuss today, we're in a populist trap. We cannot stabilize the economy without a fiscal adjustment. But if we do a fiscal adjustment that pushes the economy into a recession, that plan will not survive more than a few months or maybe a year and a half, and will get us into the stop-go cycle of reform reversal. And so that brings me to the dollarization. And I usually say dollarization is like a pizza. You may think this is a funny analogy, but pizzas, there are many pizzas. They have different taste. So we talk about pizza, and it all depends on what kind of pizza we're talking about. And dollarization, in a way, is the same, because we have the dollar being the dough, but the reality is the taste is going to be given by the ingredients. I mean, if we look at Panama, which has had the dollar as legal tender since 1904, and we look at the three countries that during the 21st century implemented dollarization, they're all different. They're very different. So there's no generic term for dollarization. When we talk about dollarization, we need to be specific. We need to know what we're talking about. And the key ingredient here is how the banking system operates. And that, because at the end of the day, 80% of the money in the economy is bank deposits. So when you dollarize, which essentially means you change the currency of your money supply, what you're basically doing an accounting entry, and you're converting deposits into US dollars. And finally, I would say the starting conditions are very important. For example, El Salvador started dollarization in a very different situation than Ecuador, and that makes a difference over time. Economists usually say, no, Argentina cannot dollarize. Argentina cannot dollarize because Argentina is not part of the dollar area. You export too much to Brazil, to the rest of Latin America, to China. So we don't fit the optimal currency area of the dollar. And economists are very much focused on trade flows, and trade flows are clearly very important, but they seem to forget financial flows. And the reality of Argentina is that we're highly dependent on financial flows, and financial flows are in dollars. So this argument that we're not in the dollar area is, I think, not a very powerful one, considering that we had persistent current account deficits and that we need to get these flows that are mostly in US dollars. Argentines, the Argentine people, they have already chosen the dollar. This chart shows you in blue the amount of liquidity, non-interest bearing assets that they hold in another currency. They hold basically in dollars. And this underestimates the amount because this graph is made with official statistics that don't incorporate the amount of money that Argentines don't declare to the tax authorities. So in reality, the percentage of dollars in the pockets of Argentine savers is much higher than it seems. And then we have the government. I said earlier, we have a currency mismatch. Well, 2/3 of Argentine debt are denominated in foreign currency, mostly the dollar. And in the next 10 years, Argentina needs to generate, on average, $22 billion every year to pay for capital and interest. For most countries, this wouldn't be a problem because you just roll over debt, issue more debt. But Argentina has a problem because if you look at the price of Argentine bonds, they're currently trading close to 20 cents on the dollar. So the idea that you're just going to roll over just doesn't work here. There's another fact we need to take into consideration. Some people say you can't dollarize, there are no reserves. Well, let's look at history. Lack of reserves is not a structural limitation of the economy, it's a structural limitation of populist policies. The reason we don't have reserves is because the central bank in Argentina wants to sell dollars at half the price that people think it's worth. And you basically create excess demand for dollars. And there are many times in Argentine history when we had plenty of reserves. So there's no basis for this argument. And in fact, I would add something else. It's never been cheaper to dollarize than today. At today's free market exchange rate, the monetary base in Argentina is worth 13 billion, which is tiny compared to the size of the economy. Now, those are macroeconomic considerations. There are also institutional, or I would say maybe political economy consideration. Juan Carlos de Pablo, a well-known Argentine economist, recently said, look, if you want to be successful in bringing inflation down, people have to believe in your plan. They have to believe that your plan, your reform is permanent. And you need three ingredients. The plan has to be designed by competent economists. It has to be implemented by an executive that believes in the benefits of the plan. And it has to be approved by a broad coalition in Congress. And it all seems very reasonable in a normal country. But Argentina has institutional anomie. So whatever Congress approves today doesn't really have a lot of value or credibility, because the same people that approve the law today will basically change it tomorrow. So if you want to think about credibility being a function of the probability of reversal, so people say, okay, you have a plan. What's the probability that down the road, a few months or a few years down the road, they will basically reverse everything you're doing? If that probability is 100, so if the market expects that to be the case, then you have zero probability or zero credibility. You can't do a successful stabilization plan. Essentially, you need a minimum credibility to be successful. An institutional anomie, which is what we suffer in Argentina as a result of so many decades of populism, puts us outside of the curve of credibility. We cannot generate credibility in Argentine jurisdiction. So we need to come up with reforms that have three characteristics. First of all, if somebody tries to reverse them, it's going to be very expensive at the election time, because it's going to hurt so many people. People are going to punish the politician that tries to reverse the reform. The second thing is that reform, or parts of that reform, have or required to be reversed the approval of a foreign jurisdiction. So Argentine politicians on their own, by themselves, cannot reverse the reform. And finally, you need to put certain obstacles on the road to reversal. You need to make it difficult. You need to increase the cost of reversal to politicians. That's the only way in which we can move to a place where any plan will be credible and successful. Now, it's very important to understand, because sometimes we get into a debate that doesn't make any sense, that dollarization by itself is not a solution. Argentina's problems exceed simply having a high inflation rate. We have many problems, and those problems require structural reforms. So dollarization by itself does not eliminate the need for those reforms. What I would say is a mechanism by which we increase the probability that those reforms will be successful, and that we're not going to fall back into that cycle of stop-go reform reversal. Okay? Now, there are many reasons why people oppose dollarization. I will mention a few. We don't have reserves. I explained that it's a one-way street, that somehow you burn the ships in a way that you can never have your currency. That's not true. There's plenty of evidence that refutes this argument. Most of the Central American countries in the first half of the 20th century used the dollar as legal tender, and then they reintroduced their domestic currency, and there was no trauma associated with it. Sometimes people say that, provincial governments will circumvent dollarization by issuing their own currency, but you cannot falsify dollars. One thing to do it when you have the peso in circulation. It's a completely different thing when you have dollars. And finally, that it's politically unfeasible. And then there are the supposed costs of dollarization. One is we lose seigniorage. So the central bank doesn't get any income for the reserves it has. Now, this argument doesn't make any sense if the people who make it are the same people that are telling you that you don't have reserves, because by definition, if you don't have reserves, you don't have seigniorage, so you can't lose what you don't have. They also tell you that we're going to lose the lender of last resort. We don't have a lender of last resort. They tell me, we're going to put the economy into a straitjacket. Well, bad news. The economy is already in a straitjacket, but it's the wrong kind of straitjacket. It's the straitjacket that is created by unnecessary regulations and taxes, etc. So we need a different kind of straitjacket. We need a straitjacket for politicians to behave responsibly and not to overspend procyclically and inefficiently. Another argument is that the economy will be more vulnerable. That's not true. The economy has been very vulnerable. Anybody who studied the Argentine economy knows that with currency, with convertibility, whatever, every time the Fed tightens, Argentina suffers. And the reason is as I said earlier, the currency mismatch in the public sector is very high. Another argument is that we lose a tool to cushion real exchange rate shocks. Bad news. Most of the real exchange rate shocks in Argentina in the last 2 decades were created by the government, by the misguided policies of the government. So we all have this fallacy of nirvana. Supposedly we're going to lose things that we don't have. That doesn't make any sense to me. But they're tangible benefits. And if we look at Ecuador in particular, we can see 20 years with the sucre and 20 years with the dollar, and you can easily see what was better for the Ecuadorian people. Now, if you compare Ecuador to Argentina, the comparison is quite bad. Argentina has lost against Ecuador in any measure that you can think of. We've done worse than Ecuador in the last 20 years. We had our own central bank, we had our own currency, and we've done worse than Ecuador. Look at unemployment, for example. Argentina never managed to bring unemployment to the levels Ecuador has had. And we had 3 major crises in the 21st century. There's another discussion that goes on about dollarization, that you need certain ideal conditions. You shouldn't dollarize unless you meet certain conditions. Well, my response is, if we had those certain conditions, I wouldn't be here talking about dollarization, because dollarization wouldn't be needed. The reason we need dollarization in Argentina is exactly because we're in very non-ideal conditions. And if you look at Ecuador, in January 2000, when they dollarized, it's hard to find a situation that was less favorable to dollarization. And 22 years later, Ecuadorian people are doing quite well. So sometimes people say, well, Ecuador is not such a good example because it hasn't done so well against other economies like Peru there, the orange line. The reality is that the counterfactual is Argentina, because the main factor behind Ecuador's economic performance has been populism. And Argentina and Ecuador had a very similar type of populism for over 10 years. And populism works very well when the commodity cycle is on the upswing, because the policies of populism are essentially to promote consumption, etc. When the cycle reverses, that's where you see the difference, and you see it in this graph very clearly. Ecuador and Argentina are at the bottom. After 2012, when the commodity cycle reversed, they started to perform very poorly. And so in a way, you can argue that populism cost Argentina about 2% a year in GDP per capita growth, and it cost much less to Ecuador. Ecuador paid half the price that Argentina paid for having populism. And if you think about vulnerability, look at the performance of GDP per quarterly GDP. In Ecuador and Argentina, we had 3 major crises in the 21st century, some of the worst crises in the last century. And there's no way anybody can argue that Ecuador did worse than Argentina. And if you look at the COVID crisis, the most recent crisis, and the thicker line there is Ecuador, and it shows the index of monthly economic activity. It's hard to argue that Ecuador performed worse than the other countries in this sample, which are the main. So I have 2 minutes. I have to be brief. One final thing about Ecuador. They had a deep crisis a few months ago, no bank runs, okay? In Argentina, when we have a political crisis, everybody rushes to the bank to get their money out. So there are many lessons about Ecuador. Ideal conditions are not necessary. It is politically difficult to reverse. It doesn't neutralize populism, but it reduces the cost of populism. It is essential to focus on the details of dollarization. It's better to have populism with dollarization than to have populism with a depreciated currency. That's for sure. And you ask any Ecuadorian and they will confirm that. It has been effective to reduce inflation. It's essentially different from from any exchange rate regime. And if you design it properly and you get the government out of the banking system, you isolate the private sector from fiscal crisis. Now, the banking system is the Achilles heel of dollarization. If you don't reform the banking system, dollarization doesn't make sense. And one other thing, the central bank is the Trojan horse of dollarization. If you want to reverse dollarization, the most effective tool you have is the central bank. So how do we dollarize? Well, when we talk about dollarization, we need to think about different dimensions. Financial, which means, do we have the resources to do it? Micro and macro consistency, which has to do with the structure of relative prices. Political, which has to do with the political system willingness to tie their hands behind their back. And finally, not to be underestimated, is the practical implementation issues. And what we need to find is the optimal dollarization that meets all these criteria. In the case of Argentina, we need to answer 4 very important questions. The first one is, where do we get the dollars to buy the money, the monetary base? The second one is, what do we do with the central bank? The third one is, what do we do with the debt of the central bank that today represents about 8% of GDP and is growing very fast? And finally, what do we do with the banks themselves? And you have to answer all these questions simultaneously. And every answer to any of these questions has to be consistent with the other. So it's a bit complicated. You have to remember that the role of the central bank in Argentina has been perverted. What you expect the central bank to do in a normal country is not what the central bank of Argentina does, okay? And what we have is a banking system that is essentially captive to deficit financing. Look at the level of the situation with the central bank. The single largest debtor in Argentina is the central bank. And so the whole economy is tied up to the financial liabilities of the banking system. So we need to resolve this without punishing the private sector. One problem that we have right now is the liabilities in the banking sector are getting very short term. Right now, 86% of time deposits in Argentina are for 30 days. And this puts the banking system in a vulnerable position because it's very easy to have a bank run. So I will get, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. I tried to do it at 2x, but I should have done it at 3x. So basically what we want to do, or what the outline of our proposal in our book, is to make the dollar the legal tender, to eliminate the peso, to basically restructure the central bank and relocate some of the functions of the central bank. So we propose creating different agencies that will replace what the central bank does. And some of those agencies, we propose to put them outside of Argentine jurisdiction so that the Argentine politicians cannot touch them. So I know I'm going to be kicked out, and I'm going to leave you without finishing the presentation, but maybe in the question and answer, we can get into more details. But in essence, this is what I wanted to share with you. And I hope we get a productive discussion out of the other presentations we have. Thank you very much.
We're not going to kick you out, and we are anticipating that we'll have lots of time for questions. So hopefully we'll be able to cover some of the expositional material there. Is Laura with us?
Online, yes.
Okay, so let me just introduce you, Laura, for a second. So she's the Warren Albert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica. From 2010 to 2012, she has an extraordinarily successful record as an academic, publishing in the very top journals. And we're very happy to have her here to give us her thoughts. And you have 10 minutes, and I have no way of stopping you from talking. So I guess we'll have to trust that you'll stop on time.
Thanks for the invitation and apologies for not being able to make it. Can you see my slides? Yes. Well, so let me just start. We don't have a lot of time. It's a very exhaustive, complete book. It was mentioned a number of pages, and in this number of pages, you do get everything you want to know, not only about Argentina, but also about economics. And something I liked about the book, as was mentioned in the presentation, the devil's in the detail. And the book does have a lot of details in terms of how to implement the reform. But also it has cases. I teach at HBS, at Harvard Business School. We like cases. So I appreciated the fact that the book has cases which uses them, if you want, like a propensity score matching, trying to find similar examples to make a case. And so talking about HBS and cases, I don't know if you know this, as it turns out in HBS, we teach many cases about Argentina, not only because we had the great and late Julio Rothenberg, but also because Rafael Di Tella is in our group, and also Alberto Cavallo. And we have used Argentina, and in fact, as I said, we have many cases, but we tend to use it to teach, as I tell our students, everything in macro. We tell them about every possible exchange rate regime, optimal currency areas, fiscal policy, monetary policy, financial system, shareholder protection, crisis, every form of crisis, default. So again, it's an exhaustive view of actual economic cases and tools, but we also use it to teach about populism. And what we tell them is that when there are weak institutions, this not only makes massive redistribution feasible, but also politically rational. We tell them about how Argentina has lost ground against US, France, and Italy. We tell them the story of how it used to be one of the great countries 2 centuries ago, and how it has diminished. Again, this graph ends in 1990, but this, if anything, has become worse in the last 30 years. We tell them the story of inflation and hyperinflation. In fact, we use this quote by Domingo Cavallo. We didn't have a currency as a basic institution. It has been completely destroyed by hyperinflation, when inflation was just over 200, and we show them the evolution of inflation, hyperinflation. We teach them that inflation is an extremely regressive tax. It is why Latin America has pervasive income inequality, and we had poverty. Once we dealt with some of these hyperinflation problems, we managed to overcome some of those, and we improve, again, Brazil being one example, Chile as well. As I said, we use the case of Argentina to teach cost benefits of every exchange rate regime. In particular, we use it to teach of two that are, for our students, hard to understand: the currency board. And then we have a discussion on whether Argentina would be better dollarized. Again, Argentina tried the currency board. I don't know if you know this, but every time we teach this at HBS, students think that is like an actual board, like board of directors. So one has to explain, what does the currency board mean? That is a fixed exchange rate regime where the government has backing of certain amount of the monetary liabilities. And again, it does mean that in theory, the central bank doesn't run out of reserves because it's backed, but it doesn't mean that you cannot have speculative attacks. And in fact, Argentina had speculative attacks, but it did remove, in theory, the option to print. In theory, it had no flexibility, no lender of last resort. But as we know, in Argentina, they found ways to go around the restriction of the backing. And so, again, we go over the different attempts that Argentina has had of trying to use exchange rate policy to try to borrow international macro institutions. And also that a logical extension of this is to try to borrow micro institutions. An example is that Argentinians issue abroad in New York law, again, trying to borrow foreign institutions. Both of these things are easier said than done. You're still subject to the country rules. And so in class, we do go to the discussion, would dollarization give Argentina more commitment? We discuss what it means is, again, the fixed exchange rate regime with monetary policy by the US. We go over the cost and benefits, which, by the way, the book does a great job in presenting the different arguments. And again, showing that the costs are not really real costs, even though it does lose some adjustment. Argentina has never really used independent monetary policy in a good way, so that's precisely what they want to take away. We go over the discussion of whether it makes sense under an optimal currency area. And again, the book tackles this, perhaps doesn't make the arguments. Again, the main trading partners are Brazil and China, although it's very dollarized. Other issues is that the labor market is extremely rigid, unionized, taxes, regulation. Again, it's asymmetric development with the US, but as was mentioned, a lot of it is self-made. And again, there is the history of high fiscal deficits and recurrent default. So from that optimal currency area, there are not a lot of arguments. However, it has never been proposed because of that. It has been always proposed as a way to provide credibility. It is a credibility rationale. The need to impose or import monetary stability due to this history of lack of credible institutions, hyperinflation. And as was mentioned, the country is already very dollarized. So an extreme version of Ulysses trying to tie himself away from the sirens. The problem, and again, the book does tackle this, is that fiscal policy will still be an issue. And Argentina has shown that what we maybe think of eliminating inflation and devaluation risk may just be piled as more default risk, again, in the country who has defaulted the most in history, and potentially also social unrest. Again, when you have lack of credible institutions, it's just hard to see how just dollarization will undo this. The other one is hard to see why people will bring back the dollar if it's still there is field of taxation and expropriation. In this course, we use this line, and again, borrow from all the folks that know more about Argentina that I do, Javier González Fraga. The real cause of Argentina's macro instability, which has been a problem in Argentina for more than a century, is the expectation of part of the Argentinian people to find shortcut solutions to fix real self-imposed problems. Argentinians are taught when they were 10 that they belong and were born in a rich country. If you believe that you are born rich, you don't accept step by step. Argentina is always looking for shortcuts into the first world. And again, development is hard, it takes every day, but there is always this implicit view in Argentina, there is a cash cow or there's someone we can take from. And again, this is the view that comes from this quote. Rafael Di Tella has also done these very interesting surveys when they were asked folks in the US and in Argentina their views on different topics. One in particular is, do you think in the long run, hard work usually brings a better life versus hard work is the outcome of luck and connections? Again, this is an old survey by Disproportional. They found out that in the US, people believe in hard work, in the US, while in Argentina, luck and connections. They also asked them whether they think private business can help versus government ownership. Again, different views in the US versus Argentina. And again, these are a little bit old, and it's possible that in the US it has switched, but definitely in Argentina has not changed in terms of their views on these topics. But one is, what is the cause of poverty? And in the US, a bias towards thinking that is laziness. In Argentina, some view that is out of their hands, some unfairness. And again, this goes back to this view that there's a cash cow or there's something that can be done that is not related to everyday work to try to change the outcomes. And just to start wrapping up, a line from Daron Acemoglu's book, the repetitive nature of unsustainable and bad macro policies Argentina stem from an underlying set of weak institutions which make massive redistribution of income feasible and politically rational. Without institutional change, distributional conflict is bound to come again. And again, in the Argentina, it takes forms of different crises. It is a country that has wasted many crises, and it doesn't seem to get their act together. So would dollarization solve the underlying distributional conflict? Honestly, I'm not as hopeful, but perhaps anything that will get the government to stop talking about the Panini album and the World Cup and the Qatar dollar is a move in the right direction. And I do think the advantages is that it puts the discussion on the table. And again, it keeps the hope that there might be a better future for Argentina. Thanks.
I mean, I'll let Aquiles speak, and then I'll let you respond to. Sure. But we'll go first with this. So Aquiles Almansi is our second discussant. He's has been an international consultant on financial systems regulation and crisis management. He served as a senior and lead financial sector analysis specialist at the World Bank, where he led crisis simulation exercises by financial sector authorities, helping them practice dealing with incidents, including cyber attacks affecting financial stability. He's published a digest on cybersecurity guidance and regulations for the financial sector. So we're very happy to have him here to add some additional comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I was one of the ones talking about dollarization in 1989. And the issue has been with me since then. It was great to read the book by Emilio and Ocampo and Nicolas Kachanowski, because there are several people talking about dollarization again in Argentina, but the only thing they talk about is dollarization. They don't talk about how to get there and the challenges. And actually, the challenges I will be mentioning are already discussed in extenso in the book, but I wanted to briefly go over just a couple of the pros, the things that are said in favor of the idea of dollarizing, and against the cons. And finally, talking about the process of dollarizing. I think it's extremely important for everybody in Argentina to think seriously about this problem and this matter. And I think Emilio's and Nicolas' contribution is really fantastic. Of course, many people may disagree with different aspects discussed in the book, but everybody, I believe, and I will try to explain briefly why I believe this needs to be in the minds of every policymaker in Argentina. Now, it is a problem when we talk about Argentina's policymakers, because Argentina is a highly polarized society. And it is polarized in several dimensions, and not only in terms of values, left and right, let's say, but also there is polarization in interpretations of reality, how people think that things work, in particular, inflation, and then another matter very close to my heart, international trade. No, some people believe that to create jobs in Argentina, you have to protect industries by essentially making it impossible or extremely expensive to import the products that they will make. And not only that, then to subsidize the inputs of these industries. For example, in the current situation, exporters get paid 50% of the dollars, the central bank buys at 50% of the market price the dollars that exporters bring, and then sells to some selected buyers the dollars at the same price. Then they say dollar Qatar, but those are irrelevant, they're rounding numbers. The big numbers are the inputs for certain industries, and they believe that that is going to create jobs. And with money, well, with money, people don't believe that the problem is that if you keep printing money, prices have to go up more or less proportionally. That is a problem. So what about arguments for dollarization? I just want to mention two. The first one is that some people are convinced that dollarizing would impose fiscal discipline, because making it impossible to print money, and then given that Argentina has lost access to the capital markets, then public spending will not be able to exceed the tax collections. There is some part of the truth is there, but I do not believe it entirely, to say the least. Don't ask me for too many details, because the only thing I've studied in my life is economics, and this is probably a problem of social psychology or for political science, let's say people more educated than I. No, I'm a sort of engineer in some sense. But my feeling is that for reasons that actually Emilio mentioned, for example, the fact that Congress can write a law today and write the opposite in 3 months or in 45 days, there are limitations to the capacity of any institution to put constraints on political behavior. And that is the fact that everybody, I think, agrees in Argentina. Second, an issue that was actually in my mind in 1989. We had a hyperinflation in 1989, and the hyperinflation ended the old-fashioned way. Somebody turned off the printing machine. And of course, that was the end of hyperinflation. But if you look at what happened in 1990, for example, looking at the price of the US dollar, it could go up or down 5–10% every day. So with such volatility, clearly the price system doesn't really work. I was deeply influenced in my days at Chicago, studying economics, of course, by reading Hayek's story about the role of the price system. I had learned about the supply and demand curves from Marshall in high school, but I think I only finally understood what the price system is by reading that famous paper that originated the economics of information, which was the thing that I like to study in my PhD study days. So that's why Carlos Rodriguez and I, one of my great professors in my days as a student at SEMA, and then a colleague at the time when I had decided to go back to Argentina to teach at SEMA, we started talking about dollarization as a possibility to stabilize. And that didn't happen, among other reasons. One that Emilio mentioned, somebody that shall not be mentioned, but is an important politician today, complained that dollarizing would be losing the so-called seigniorage. No? Okay, fine, sure. But at the time, then Minister Cavallo was able to come up with a close relative, the convertibility law. It's not the same thing that dollarization, but there is a logical connection to it. It's a fixed exchange rate, a real fixed exchange rate system with monetary liabilities with assets behind. I was a member of the board of directors of the central bank between 96 and 2000, so I can say that I did see the numbers, unless they They were funny numbers that we had the reserves that we claimed we had. And it did lead to the only extended period of price stability in the last 70 years, from 91 to 2001. And not only that, it was able to survive something like the tequila crisis that hit in December 94 in Mexico, and had then an impact on many other countries, including Argentina. And we had a lot of bank runs and a full mess. I actually was convinced at the time that we were going to crash again, no? But we did not. And we did not. And the thing lasted until 2000. Now, what about negative things? Just a couple of things. One that I had not had in mind in 1989, and Emilio also mentioned, but in 97, when I had maybe at most a year sitting at the board of directors of the central bank, I paid my last visit to one of my former professors at Chicago, Larry Shastad, and I started talking about dollarization and the convertibility, and he said, yeah, but if you look at the time series, you will see that every time that the US dollar appreciates, the commodity prices go down, including the Argentinian commodities, the ones that we export. And if you have all prices in US dollars, you may end up in trouble because tax revenues go down, and income from many activities goes down, and consequently, you may end up having a lot of defaults. Okay, conceptually, that made a lot of sense. I did run some numbers, and for example, the volatility of the real exchange rate of the euro is lower than that of the US dollar in Argentina. So it worked. But eventually we had the problem in 97, precisely a few months later with the Asian crisis, and then in 98 with the Russians thing, and we did have problems that the central bank led to talking about the impact on loan portfolios. Now, to conclude, Argentina has been in a process of dollarization for many years now. High value payments are done, particularly real estate transactions, are done either with bags of $100 bills or with transfers between the buyers and the seller's account in Miami or wherever. Is it possible to dollarize everything? Well, I was in El Salvador in 2004, 2005, 2006, and I saw the problems when you do not have enough change, etc. I am a smoker. So if I go to buy cigarettes in a kiosk, I need pesos. Well, do we need pesos? I'm not sure anymore. 15 years later, we have now the stable coins. And that makes it possible for everybody to have in his phone something that is the logical equivalent, and in some places the legal equivalent, to a deposit somewhere in Jamaica, sorry, in Bahamas or wherever. And consequently, it is possible to pay a few cents of dollar in Argentina today. And by the way, Argentina is one of the largest adopters of these things. Not everybody knows about it. The government doesn't talk about it. Or you don't read about it in the newspapers. But I do know that these things have been in use for quite a while now. So we have the possibility of converging de facto to dollarization. And that means going through another hyperinflation or something pretty close. So that's why I believe that it's extremely important to do what Emilio and Nicolas have done, to start thinking about it, how to do it orderly to avoid the collapse. Another a central contribution of the book, which has not been discussed by anybody, including myself in 1989, what to do with the financial system. For some people, including the godfather of my first daughter, that shall not be mentioned, of course, but is mentioned in the book, well, everybody can have a bank account in Miami, let's say. No, that is not possible. We do need local financial intermediation, and that is great contribution of the book. You may disagree with the details, but if you disagree with the details, please think in alternatives, because this thing may happen to us. Politicians may dislike the idea, but it may happen. And if it happens, we better have an idea how to make it orderly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amelia, are there any comments? Is there anything you'd like to say directly to the discussants' comments, or should we open it up to the discussion, get some questions from the floor first?
Yeah, I would make one comment. Dollarization clearly is not going to resolve the distributional conflict in Argentina. And that's not what dollarization is meant to do. Dollarization, official dollarization, as I propose it, is simply going to recognize a fact. And the fact is that the Argentine economy is de facto dollarized. And the situation we have now is a reality that the government wants to deny, but the de facto dollarization means that the tools of economic policy don't work as well as they would in a normal situation. So dollarization is not going to solve all of Argentina's problems, clearly, but it's going to give us stability. And if you look at history, there was only one time in the last 70 years, as Achilles mentioned, when we had price stability and reform, and that was during the 90s. And what we have to do, you cannot do reforms without stability, because the markets don't work. The markets are confused. Nobody knows what the value of things are. So if the price system is not working properly, it's very hard for structural reforms to be effective. So I always emphasize, dollarization is not a magic potion. Dollarization is not going to solve the problems. Dollarization is going to help you solve the problems, but it's not going to solve the problems. Dollarization may do now, if done properly, and I always emphasize the issue of if it is well designed and well implemented, it's going to do what convertibility did in the first years, 91, 94. There are many challenges, but I think as we veer very closely to hyperinflation now, we may get to a point when we're not going to have any other option. So that's my only comment so far.
All right, so I think we've got some time for some questions. So if anyone, if someone has a question, have you got a microphone? Bring the microphone. So can you please identify who you are?
Hello, I'm Peter Angel. I'm a student in Georgetown right now. And I'm sort of curious, why dollarization as opposed to like euroization or some other currency?
Well, it's a good question. There are two reasons why the European Union has a much stricter rules to belong to the Eurozone. And so there are countries that are currently in line waiting. You know, there's the Maastricht Treaty. So you can unilaterally dollarize, which means you choose the dollar as legal tender without asking anybody. But it's very hard to do it with the euro. In fact, the Eurozone has put a lot of pressure. There are two countries in Europe that unilaterally adopted the euro because originally they had chosen the Deutschmark. And when Germany joined the Eurozone, they basically went along with that. So it's not possible to do euroization, let's say. But nevertheless, the way we see dollarization is simply that the dollar is the legal tender with which, you know, basically you have to use the dollar to pay the government. But you can use any currency you want, even if you want to use Bitcoin. I mean, we propose a totally free system where people actually can choose the currency with which they operate. And so we wouldn't prevent anybody from, if they want to do contracts in euros or in yens, as long as it's a convertible currency, we don't have an issue with that. So we would leave a system where multiple currencies actually compete with each other.
We have two questions over there.
Alberto Ades. Can you distinguish between dollarization, which is what you seem to have in mind, which is eliminating the peso, from a system in which you can still have the peso?
Well, certainly. If you think about Panama, for example, in Panama, the Balboa still exists, but it's not, legally, it's a currency, but everybody uses the dollar. So the question is whether you impose a currency on people forcibly. And the problem with the peso is that it doesn't have credibility. And because of the institutional setting we have, it will never have credibility with this setting. So there are many proposals out there that basically would entail having the dollar compete with the peso. And that I think it's generally a bad idea. I don't think it makes sense to have the peso, because you basically create two different economies within Argentina, one that works with the dollar and is going to work relatively well, and another one which is probably going to tie it up to the government sector that is going to be paid in pesos, and the peso will continue to depreciate. So you can think, I mean, if you think about the bimonetary system, the great innovator there was Lenin, because in 1922, Lenin thought that the best way to destroy capitalism was to unleash inflation. And so he had the great idea that, that's what he had to do in Russia to eradicate forever the capitalist mentality of the bourgeoisie. And so he unleashed hyperinflation in Russia, and he realized that hyperinflation was as bad for a communist system as it was for the capitalist system. And then he decided to change, and he introduced a very successful monetary reform. And he had two currencies running in parallel, one that was fully convertible to gold and the other one that was not. This experiment didn't last very long because Lenin died, and the whole, and another important issue is that this monetary reform was not simply a monetary reform. It was a big reform of the economy. They decided to reintroduce, markets and to some extent private property. So it was a liberalization of the Soviet economy. It was a short-lived experiment, but they managed to bring down inflation. So I think you could possibly do a bimonetary solution. My problem with short-term solutions is that the cycle of reversal is very detrimental to progress. I mean, if we embark on something and 2 years down the road, we turn around and we do exactly the opposite, which is the pattern we've had for the last 30 years. I mean, we go from going in this direction, and then 10 years later, we go in this direction. And that is impossible. It makes it impossible for the private sector to make any planning. So I think I think you need to go with something that people would believe that it's not going to be reversed. And as long as you leave the peso in circulation, you're going to have a problem, because you're going to have currency mismatches everywhere, and you have the temptation of populist politicians to always inflate the currency. So we explain some of these issues in the book as well. But
how's that, Louis? Yeah. Could you just, we better wait because people are listening online. I can't hear.
My question goes to if you have thought the political implementation, the political dynamics that could lead to the implementation of dollarization, given precisely your description of our political system. And if today there are, some significant politicians who eventually would like dollarization.
A very good question. In fact, in the preface of our book, we say two things. First of all, it's hard to imagine that you could do dollarization in Argentina unless part or all of Peronism somehow, or at least a sector of Peronism, supports it. Because, in a way, dollarization means the politicians will have to tie their hands behind their back. And so the next question after I say this is, why would they do that? And the only reason they would do that is because we're at the verge of hyperinflation. And we say that in the book. Unfortunately, bringing back Lenin again, that famous phrase, to get better, it has to get worse. And unfortunately, if you look at radical monetary reform in Argentina and democracy, it's always been done when the monthly inflation rate exceeds 10% per month. The Austral plan was done with 20% monthly inflation. The convertibility plan was done with 11% monthly inflation. So why would the politicians do anything? Because when we cross that threshold, they're going to start to panic, and they will say, We don't want to go into that direction. Remember, we have one thing that is different from the past, the poverty levels in Argentina. And with hyperinflation, the poverty, the situation, the social situation, it's going to get really, really, really bad. So my sense is that the politicians will not react as a group, let's say, and will not support dollarization unless they look at the specter of hyperinflation and say, we need to stop this now.
We're running out of time. We'll just take a couple more minutes just so Laura, while you've been sitting there very patiently, is there anything else you'd like to add? Or is there anything, other comments you would like to make? And I'll ask Achilles the same thing.
No, I don't have much to say other than, for example, Venezuela has crossed that level and hasn't done it. So it's not given that politicians will necessarily do it if hyperinflation, although one does hope that they may want to react. But having said that, I still think that a plan that doesn't tackle these unfair views that are intrinsic in Argentina, even if you make it very hard to change, may not be as sustainable as it was mentioned. So I would suggest to add to the plan something to tackle some of these redistributional concerns in the country.
Thank you. And Achilles, would you like to add anything?
I think that very much as Emilio said, is going to be a scenario of high and actually I would add increasing inflation that might lead to policymakers to consider an orderly dollarization, preventing a catastrophic de facto dollarization that would destroy the financial system, of course, but also would produce the social impact that Emilio mentioned. Argentina has around 47 million inhabitants, and there are 22 million who now get some kind of income from the government. Imagine that money disappears in Argentina. I hope not to be visiting when it happens. No? So that's why I believe that anybody, regardless of what you think about dollarization, about what you think about the dollar, these days to have a good opinion about the dollar is a problem. No? But regardless of what your feelings are about the idea of dollarization, please start thinking what you would do if the thing cannot be avoided, because the scenario of a de facto dollarization can be really catastrophic. So that's why I think everybody, again, regardless of what side of the grieta, the fissure of the Argentinian politics they sit, they should be reading the book and coming up with whatever alternative they have in mind, but some coherent idea on how to get there without a disaster.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I mean, thank you very much, people.
I'm Monica.
Okay, everyone's seated, so. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the second panel of the day. My name is Denise Yanovich, and I'm the Managing Director of the Georgetown Americas Institute, and Alejandro is the Director. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We are going to start the second panel on monetary policy options to bring inflation down. We will first hear from Guillermo Mondino, who's going to do a 20-minute presentation. Guillermo is an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. He's also a consultant to financial institutions. And he previously was a chief economist and strategist at Mogador Capital Management and worked at Wall Street with several organizations, Citibank, Barclays Capital, and Lehman Brothers. Before joining Wall Street, he had experience in the policy world where he held roles in the Ministry of the Economy in Argentina. Guillermo holds a PhD in economics from Yale University. His bio is a lot more extensive. You can check that on our website, but I don't want to take time from his presentation. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's actually smooth transition from the previous panel because in fact, the Argentines here today, including Pablo and myself, we have all worked at some point or another on dollarization. In my case, in the episode of dollarization in Ecuador, and Pablo, he worked also in Ecuador, but mostly in the government of Argentina negotiating with the US Treasury back in the late 90s, I guess, for sharing seigniorage if Argentina decided to go in the direction of dollarization. So dollarization is a dear topic for most Argentines, but and I continue to take a very pragmatic approach towards the choice of an anchor, an exchange rate regime, or a monetary reform when thinking about how to stabilize going forward. But I guess my mind has shifted a little bit over time. And now I think that this is dollarization ultimately is going to end up being a bit of a shortcut that is going to end up proving traumatic and probably unsuccessful. So I will talk about an alternative to dollarizing, and which is basically trying to do all the hard work that needs to be done, and hope that the roadmap that I'm going to lay out in front of you is feasible and something that the next administration can undertake. So let's put the next slide, please. I don't have control over this. Yeah, there we go. All right, so a couple of quick quotes that I think motivate this. Very much like Emilio, I start with the first quote. This time is from Milton Friedman, who said, "Only a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change." And I think we all agree on that account, and we all agree that Argentina is getting very close to that real crisis that will bring, hopefully, real change in the country. The second quote is from Tom Sargent, who actually, in his letter to another Brazilian finance minister, it was the second letter that he wrote to a Brazilian finance minister. Tom was saying that persistent high inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon, a play of words, of course, with Friedman's own quote, and in which the central bank is a monetary accomplice to whatever the Treasury is doing. Now, Tom Sargent's quote is much richer than that because he goes into the problem that governments issuing debt end up generating the seeds of monetization of those public deficits, and expectations of that monetization end up creating a significant challenge for the economy in terms of current inflation. Now, that is very much the type of problem that Argentina faces today. And it is, in fact, as if Tom Sargent was writing a letter to the Argentine finance minister today. I very much strongly recommend those that have not looked at it to look at this very powerful letter that he wrote several years back. So anyway, how to construct a stabilization program? I guess very much like Emilio, the concern here is to build something that is credible. And by a credible inflation program, we basically share the same idea that it has to be one where the authorities face a set of circumstances that will make it unlikely that they'll have the incentives to deviate from their initial objectives. Okay, that is another way of saying that it is a time consistent program, but it basically gets to the core of the problem that we want to prevent the authorities from changing course down the road. And the more consistent the program is in its initial design, the greater the chances of success. Argentina, of course, sports a very poor reputation in terms of stabilization effort. Alex mentioned the number of IMF programs that Argentina has had, the number of stabilization attempts that Argentina has had, the number of monetary experiments that Argentina has had are plentiful. And so I guess that what I'm going to try to propose today is to experiment a little bit less and try to do something that is a little bit closer to a traditional stabilization program that many other countries have attempted in the past and have been successful with. Finally, any announcement in Argentina will inevitably carry a little credibility, including dollarization, because with dollarization, the first thing people are going to start thinking about is, okay, we now have the dollar, but what if the government tomorrow starts printing its own currency once again? We did it back in 2001, and why wouldn't we do it again once again? So even hard dollarization will carry the seeds of little credibility to begin with. Now, little credibility will have a significant cost. And so the more consistent the program is, the less that cost is going to be. And I'm going to try to focus a bit on how to reduce that cost. And finally, there should be, like with any program, I would advocate for a full buying in of the political authorities behind the program. Obviously, in the previous panel, we talked a lot about the political support that is needed in the end in order to go in that direction. Emilio was saying something that at least some of the Peronist party will need to support dollarization. I will argue that it's not necessarily the case that we will need the strong support of the opposition when the program gets launched, because I don't think it's going to be this government, by the way. I do think that when the program gets launched, what will be needed is that the authorities in charge need to be buying in deeply into the program, understanding what the consequences and the circumstances are likely to be, so that they don't deviate and give an opportunity for the program to be successful. Now, what will credibility depend on? The credibility will, please, the next slide, the other one as well, next one. Credibility will be dependent on a consistent design, clear communication, and of course, consistent design means that fiscal and monetary and exchange rate policies must be consistent with each other. Consistent design also means that it has to be consistent over time, not just at a given point in time. It has to be something that when you are you're undertaking the program today, you're not planting the seeds of the program's own demise 6 months or a year down the road. The program also needs to be properly funded. A properly financed program will reduce the probability of settling on a bad equilibrium. And this, of course, is a call to the multilateral institutions so that they come up with a way to support Argentina when a new program is put in place. The program must minimize the ex-ante sacrifice ratio. The sacrifice ratio is basically the cost in terms of activity that a country suffers when attempting to stabilize. And different people measure it in different ways, but it's usually the loss in output relative to potential that gets sacrificed per point of reduction of inflation. And so minimizing the sacrifice ratio will be an important consideration, because an economy in recession at the early stages of a stabilization makes the stabilization less credible. We see it today in the US. As soon as the Fed started tightening monetary policy, even before we see inflation starting to come down, there's a lot of concern and strong lobby coming up so that the Fed eases up. So having a program that minimizes the potential sacrifice ratio is going to be an important consideration. A credible and transparent monetary and fiscal reaction function must be laid out, because if the way in which we're going to convince people that the authorities are serious is if there is a clear way in which they're going to respond to changes that take place. So if inflation is a little bit higher, it has to be clear how the authorities are going to respond to the fact that inflation is higher than the authorities have promised. And if inflation is lower, it has to also be clear how the authorities are going to respond. Policy must be flexible to absorb future real shocks. Here's a big deviation from the dollarization. I do believe that the more flexible the system is to change, to adapt to the changing circumstances, to the terms of trade shocks, to the real shocks that an economy suffers, the more credible it's going to be. That's going to make it much more long-lasting, much more likely that the next set of authorities are going to keep the program in place. The objectives must be attainable. You have to have a realistic program. You cannot promise that you're going to bring inflation down in a matter of months to zero or to very low levels. You cannot promise that poverty is going to go down to zero, or that inflation is going to go down from 25 to 5% in a very short period of time. It has to be realistic. And if it is realistic and consistent with the setup of the program, then you have a shot. And finally, there must be a simple, low-cost exit strategy if things are not working out the way that you want. Because if what the costs at the end are very large, what you are going to end up having is that you're going to be putting off adjusting the program, sort of tying your hands and sort of grabbing even more strongly an inconsistent, unsustainable program, making the costs much larger. And I think that's also a potential problem with a hard peg or hard exchange rate system. So what are the macroeconomic conditions that I think Argentina will face when stabilization gets launched? Please, next slide. So I think Argentina will face a set of conditions that are not going to make it very easy to stabilize. The first is large and sustained primary fiscal deficits will have been in place for over 10 years. By then, every quarter sporting primary deficit is not going to make it very credible that Argentina is going to reduce the deficit fast. But this is a precondition for any stabilization of any kind. There will be a large and growing stock of interest-bearing central bank debt. We already have a large stock of central bank debt. I think I have a different number than Emilio. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I'm closer to 12% of GDP in terms of central bank debt at this point. And this central bank debt, of course, generates quasi-fiscal deficits and a number of difficulties at the time of stabilizing. There will be a domestic financial repression expressed in the way of forcing banks to hold government debt, forcing local agents to hold government debt, and of course, restricting locals from buying foreign assets. So there will be highly distortionary and a big gap between the financial market exchange rate and the official exchange. I also believe that at the time when the announcements come into place with a new program, the exchange rate will continue to be undervalued, and there will be a need for a realignment of the exchange rate. And finally, there will be other relative prices that will be out of whack, and those are particularly public utility prices that I think are going to continue to be out of whack. So all these things will need to be addressed at the time of stabilization, and all of that creates a very tall order to be conducted with a new stabilization program. What are the proposed actions? Next slide, please. Okay, so the proposed actions are to have a two-stage stabilization process. The first stage is a shock approach that attempts to bring down inflation from levels that are likely to be comfortably above 100% annual rate, probably around 10% per month at the time that the stabilization is put in place, followed by a more gradual approach because I don't think inflation will fall down to 5% overnight. The experience in many countries, including Israel, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and so on, is that inflation falls rapidly at the beginning. Once it gets to a moderate level, somewhere between 15 and 25%, it gets much harder to bring inflation down. And from that point on, it takes several years to bring that inflation down to low single digits. So I do envision an initial shock to bring it down to moderate levels, and then a more gradual approach like many other countries have done. I do envision a fiscal reform very early in the process, a fiscal reform of a magnitude of about 5 points of GDP within a year. This is a large fiscal adjustment, but it's not unheard of. We just went through a 4 points of GDP primary fiscal adjustment in 2018 and 19. So a 5 point is not too far off that magnitude of fiscal adjustment that we saw in the 2-year period in 18 and 19. Argentina will need a realignment of relative prices. Part of that realignment will come together with the fiscal adjustment because it will be the normalization of public utilities. We need to have the realignment of relative prices happen before stabilization, because you cannot start a stabilization program, whatever that stabilization program is, if you still need to increase some prices by several hundred-fold, okay? If you need couple 100% increases in public utility prices and you dollarize, that's going to generate a jump in the price level that you're going to have to pay for eventually as you undo the overvaluation of the exchange rate that takes place once you undertake these movements. So realignment of relative prices is going to be a precondition for stabilization. It's probably going to be a good idea to pass a law to provide the central bank with independence, at least independence in the way of providing the central bank with the tools to conduct an independent set of actions of monetary policy. And obviously, a policy that restricts the amount of financing the central bank will provide the Treasury. It'll be important to reduce the monetary overhang that is generated by these very strong monetary liabilities that the central bank has, that I mentioned is in the order of 12 points of GDP. Finally, I think that in the first year, in the shock approach to addressing this issue, you're probably going to need to break the inflation inertia that is in place. And this is also going to take place in a two-stage process, the way I imagine. First is to coordinate the price setting process by shrinking the length of time in the indexation process so that we get the resetting, the staggering of prices gets much more limited and the price setting becomes much more coincident in terms of time. And this is going to lead to a much lower level of inertia in the economy as we go forward. And the second thing is eventually, I think there will be a need for a recontracting framework a la Brazil, the way that the Brazilians did it in the Real Plan, which I think would be a very smart thing to attempt once inflation has become a genuine nominal problem because you have addressed the fiscal issues. I do think that at that point in time, very much like Brazil did in its stabilization in 1994, I think a monetary reform like the one they did would be a wise solution. And finally, stabilization, the real stabilization plan should come with a choice of nominal anchor and a smart policy reaction function. So let me let's move on, please, on the slides. The next one, please. Okay. All right. So the way I think about this is I think there will be these two stages in the very early part of the program between 2014 and 2015. As I said, I believe the stabilization will only be feasible once you have a new set of authorities with some credibility and some capacity to legislate. That will happen probably towards the end of 2023. So early in 2024, there should be fiscal reforms, adjustment in relative prices. The first ways to address the monetary overhang problems that I do believe require just a cleaning up of the balance sheet of the central bank. No restructuring of the debt, no redenomination of the central bank debt, just trying to keep that debt clean so that by the moment that you launch the stabilization plan, you have an easy way to reduce interest rates. And I'll address that in a minute. And then the second stage is the stage where I think there will be a change, a fundamental change in the set of policy rules, in particular in the monetary policy rules. We are going to switch from a system where we have active fiscal policy and passive money at the beginning of 2025 to a system with an active monetary policy and passive fiscal policy. And here the key is the emphasis on both active monetary and passive fiscal, where fiscal is going to have to adjust to the changes in monetary policy that take place. Now, next slide, please. So how do I envision anchoring the economy? Well, I do think that the pragmatic way to approach this is to choose a nominal anchor that is that sort of fits the circumstances of the countries at that point in time. You'll be able to use more the exchange rate as an anchor if you have abundant reserves. If you don't have international reserves, then it's going to be almost impossible to use the exchange rate. So let's be pragmatic about the choice of anchor. It would be my first piece of advice. Since I don't believe there will be a lot of international reserves available to use the exchange rate as an anchor, then my proposal is going to be to choose a money anchor in the process. Now, how do I think that we should anchor the economy at that point? I do believe in setting an inflation target, a 12-month forward inflation targeting scheme, so that the authorities say that, in early 2025, that during 2025, inflation is going to be no higher than 25%. All right? And it's a 12-month forward target that you set for yourself. And that target resets every month, because every month you're looking at the next 12 months, okay? So if in the first month you miss the target, well, you are going to adjust policy to hopefully hit the target starting in the second month with the same objective as you had before. The idea is to have a target on inflation with a sharp disinflation at the very beginning of the program, and then a gradually reduction in inflation in the second stage sometime later on, once we have hit these intermediate levels of inflation. The second set of anchors is going to be to set the policy interest rate at a level that is with real rates that are very close to those in the United States, a little bit above the rates in dollars. Okay, so very little premium for being invested in pesos. Now, why do I need this very low real interest rates? Because since I'm going to be restricting the central bank from financing the budget, what I'm going to be doing is releasing the seigniorage that the central bank captures normally with an inflation rate of, say, 15 or 20%. That seigniorage is now going to be used to reduce the stock of central bank debt. So now the central bank is not going to be transferring this to the treasury. It's just going to keep that money that is being raised in the form of inflation tax to reduce the stock of debt in a gradual fashion. The only way I get to do that is if my real interest rate is low, such that it is sufficiently low to be less than the amount of seigniorage that we're going to get. So if you're going to get 2 percentage points of GDP in real in seigniorage during the first year of the program, your real interest rate better be sufficiently low such that 2% is enough to cover that real rates plus a little bit of a reduction in central bank liabilities. The third set of important elements here is to eliminate, as I've said, the capacity of the central bank to finance the treasury. And finally, to support this with exchange rate bands that you're going to be able to set at a level that's wide enough depending on the stock of reserves. If you really want to anchor expectations, tight central bank, tight foreign exchange bands would probably be advisable, but that will depend on the amount of reserves that you have to sort of play the game of stabilization of the exchange rate that will follow. And so, but the idea is that you can sort of convey a better signal of the direction that you're going if your bands are relatively tight. And that, of course, depends on the international support that will be available. Finally, in the policy reaction function, please, next slide. Yes, I know. Yeah, but just give me a second, because this is the key to nail the program. As I mentioned, you can nail the program by having a proper set of reaction functions. Traditionally, in inflation targeting, you set the interest rate as your instrument, and you move your interest rates up and down, and hope that that movement of interest rates generates enough change in expectations that will stabilize the economy. So I'm advocating something along those lines, but with a small coefficient for the changes in interest rates in response to inflation, because we are going to need to keep interest rates sort of tight so that the quasi-fiscal deficit doesn't blow up when given the large stock of debt that the central bank has. So how am I going to compensate for this fact? Well, we're going to have a rule on the fiscal side where the Treasury commits to capitalize the central bank whenever the central bank tightens monetary policy and it has to increase interest rates, and that increases the cost of the quasi emerging from the quasi-fiscal. I'm going to require the Treasury to capitalize the central bank, and that means that the Treasury will need to undertake on the margin additional fiscal adjustments when that is the case. So if everything goes fine and you don't need this rule, that would be great. But it is likely that at some point in the first 18 months of the program, you're going to be tested. And when you're tested, then the Treasury needs to back up very rapidly what the monetary authorities are doing. So there's this link between the fiscal rule and the interest rate rule that I propose need to be coming together in order to anchor the program. And finally, the exchange rate rules comes to help stabilize expectations. And the tighter, as I said, the tighter the rules are, the more effective the program is likely to be. All right, so since I'm run out of time, I'm going to close here, just emphasizing that what this system has is it has no real difficulties to change any of the instruments along the way as circumstances are changing. You're not undertaking very hard commitments to a very fixed rule, and you are not I mean, the tough and most difficult part of this program is the fiscal adjustment that needs to take place in the first year, and that fiscal adjustment may have a cost on activity. But hopefully, if the stabilization comes relatively quickly, if you're buying credibility, that cost of activity is going to be moderate, and therefore, by launching a credible, consistent stabilization program, it'll be able to very quickly in 2025 turn the page and produce some rebound in economic activity. And with that, I'm going to close here. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you. So now we're going to move to our discussants. We have Monica De Boye and Pablo Guidotti. Monica is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, and she was a former director for Latin American Studies and Emerging Markets at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. During the COVID-19 pandemic, beyond becoming a YouTube star in Brazil, because I know you had a lot of following, you also expanded your studies into public health research and specialized in immunology, genetics, and biochemistry at Harvard Medical School. Monica holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics and now is pursuing a degree here at Georgetown University in infectious diseases and human immunology. Paulo is a professor at the School of Government and member of the board of directors of the Universidad Torquato Di Tella and partner and head of research and strategy at Tenec Asset Management. He was Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary of the Treasury of Argentina, He also served as co-chair of the G22 working group on strengthening the financial system and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. They both have published extensively. I'm not gonna go through their bibliographies. You will each have 10 minutes to comment on Guillermo's presentation. Thank you. So Monica and then you, Pam.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Alejandro for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I do have to disclose that I'm a Brazilian amongst Argentinians. So, you know, and I also wanted to focus my remarks on essentially the monetary reform, I suppose, but sort of with the Real plan in mind, because I think this is, Guillermo, more or less the direction that you were going. Absolutely. Yeah. So I have many thoughts on Argentina, which I won't share with you, being the Brazilian and the non-expert. But the essential one is that, of course, I find the Argentine situation fascinating in many, many respects. And I think the juncture that Argentina is in is truly one where there is an opportunity to actually change. I know we have said this thousands of times for Argentina, but I think we are at that juncture. So let me give you some thoughts on how that experience went down in Brazil. Brazil was facing that juncture in the mid-90s. It adopted the Real plan in 1994. The Real plan was, I'll just give you the highlights, but there are some things about the Real plan which make it particularly special for the time when it was introduced specifically. The Real plan was unlike the previous 6 failed stabilization attempts in Brazil, a country that had 20 years of hyperinflation. It was not a plan that was supposed to take people by surprise. It was a pre-announced plan. It was announced to everybody, to the population at large, that this was coming. It started with a lot of reforms, so very much along the lines that Guillermo was discussing. So fiscal reforms and a number of other reforms were put in place before the actual plan and the monetary reform actually happened. And when the monetary reform happened, the monetary reform was actually the introduction of a virtual currency. Imagine, this was in the mid-90s. It was the introduction of a virtual currency, or something like a virtual currency, and that currency was remunerated. So there were 2 major innovations here. On the one hand, the use of a virtual currency. On the other hand, at a time when nobody spoke of virtual currencies, and on the other, the use of a currency, of a virtual currency that actually remunerated. You know, it was an asset. It was an asset in the sense of not just being liquid, but it was also an asset in the sense that it had interest rates attached to it. Why was that necessary? That was necessary because after 20 years of hyperinflation, a number of failed stabilization attempts, all of which looked more or less the same. So all of them involved monetary reforms, and the monetary reforms were all about, we introduce a new currency, we cut out some zeros, we do some reforms here and there, and then boom, here we go. We have another plan in place. And then, of course, you know, these involved also a number of other measures like price freezes and wage freezes and things that just simply didn't work. And we did that over and over and over again, to a point where the population at large simply did not trust the currency anymore, whatever currency that was. So this is very much like the peso in Argentina. You know, it's a currency that nobody trusts and that nobody wants to hold. And therefore, the monetary reform that had to be put in place had to introduce something else. It couldn't be about cutting off zeros. It couldn't be about, you know, just doing stuff that people would perceive as having been done before. It had to be really something truly innovative, and that people bought as being, okay, this is going to work now because there's something to it. There's something behind it. So the plan started with the reforms to lay the ground for that buildup of credibility, which is the point that Guillermo started with, and this was key for the success of the Real plan. And once the buildup of credibility was found to be sort of enough, of course, this is a very judgmental call and completely subjective, but once it was judged that it was enough, the URV, the Unidade Real de Valor, was introduced. And the Unidade Real de Valor, the URV, was what was later going to become the real. The URV at the beginning was simply a virtual currency. It was actually published every day in the newspaper. You had, the value of the URV. Everything was indexed to the URV. So Brazil had a problem of inertia that was long-standing. It was, the early studies on inflationary inertia were all done on Brazil and Argentina. And the way to break inertia was to break the indexing that was widespread in the economy. And that was done by using the URV as the index, as the main thing that you would index prices to. So prices and wages were indexed to the URV. The URV, as I said, was remunerated. It also fluctuated according to whatever was happening to the exchange rate. There was a rule. It was a very transparent rule. And so the value of the URV was published in the newspaper every day, and so that people knew exactly how prices and everything else were going to fluctuate. That process, or that experience of having the URV work in that way, lasted a few months in order to get people used to the fact that the currency now was this underlying thing that did not have a physical representation, but it existed in lieu of the currency that was actually being used. So there was a very interesting psychology that went on with this monetary reform, because the currency, the actual bills that were used, they were still Cruzeiro reais at the time. However, the way by which the reform was done made people understand that while Cruzeiro reais might have been used, the real thing the real currency that was basically, indexing prices, indexing wages, and making the economy move was the URV. So there was a separation between sort of the currency that you used on everyday exchange and what was really seen as the currency, which was this virtual thing that was not yet in circulation. And the day of the announcement, the announcement of when the URV would be converted into 1 unit of a real, that was also pre-announced. So everybody was prepared to accept that on that day in June of 1994, the URV was going to become the effective currency, and all of the Cruzeiros reais in circulation were going to be, as a matter of fact, confiscated. Nobody saw this as confiscation. Why? Because those Cruzeiro reais, they had no value. They were just the paper that you were using to exchange, to use as a unit of exchange, nothing else. And that's how the plan worked. The buildup of credibility was massively important. The communication that this new currency that was completely different from anything that had been done in the past, that communication was made very clear. The process of making people untangle their psychological mindsets from whatever had previously been done and whatever was the currency in circulation was not now the new currency that was going to be made available. And that worked. The bottom of all of this, and one of the sustaining pillars for this, was, of course, an exchange rate based stabilization. So Brazil did use the exchange rate as a nominal anchor for quite a few years after the real came into being. But it was successfully abandoned. Well, there was a crisis in January of 1999, and at that point, the nominal anchor, the exchange rate anchor, was abandoned in favor of an inflation targeting regime, without a lot of issues. I mean, there was, of course, a little bit of inflation as a result of the devaluation that occurred once we had the financial crisis in '99, but that soon dissipated, which was a complete break from the past. And that also showed that the credibility that the real had gained was there to stay, because we went through a crisis with the real, banned an important nominal anchor, and the real was still credible. So to bring all these lessons to Argentina, I think in the comments that you made, you didn't actually get to the monetary reform part. But the critical thing is, apart from all of these things that you do in the early stages to build credibility, You need to get that monetary reform right, and you need to be able to introduce this kind of psychological break in the perception of what the country's currency actually is. So these are my initial comments. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Alejandro, for inviting me here. And
I think your microphone is off. Oh, no, in the, there. Thank you.
you listen to me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
So thank you, Ale. And I enjoyed a lot reading Guillermo's presentation. And of course, with the situation that Argentina is in now, it's difficult to have disagreements among many of us as economists. So I will concentrate my remarks essentially on the views that I have on these issues for the future of Argentina. And it was very interesting your presentation of how the real worked in them. So Argentina today faces profound economic problems, okay, as you all know. And in a certain sense, they are so profound that they require very conventional fiscal and monetary policy. In addition, Argentina needs also structural reforms, but on the macro framework, I think that the more we go down in the route of crisis, the more it becomes clear that we cannot rely on magic in terms of finding the Argentine solution to the problems, okay? Just to, if we have to define the currency, the current policy framework is one where there is excessive deficit financed by money creation, high inflation in the order of 100%, low net international reserves. In fact, the latest IMF document says that Argentina has $2 billion of net reserves and minus 3.6 liquid, okay, once you take out gold. The Argentine government is desperate to get reserves. So it has embarked into a growing use of discretional multiple exchange rate practices and discretional import restrictions. And in Argentina, 80% of imports are used, are intermediate goods for production, okay? So the only thing that one can imagine is that Argentina will enter or is entering into a recession that will probably get worse in the coming months. Has, a lot of distortions that Guillermo have emphasized, mostly due to capital controls, to essentially the effort to control rising inflation by maintaining misaligned utility prices and so on. And finally, has a history of successive defaults and the restructuring, the latest in 2020, okay? But it's interesting that Argentina in 2020 restructured bonds that came out from the 1995 restructuring, which actually came out from restructuring bonds that were restructured during the Brady plan, okay? So it's like, and now when you read the fund and you read the section of the report that it talks about capacity to repay the fund, it says, well, there is sufficient debt to the private sector that can be restructured if things go wrong, Okay, so they are already thinking that maybe in 2024, 2025, a new restructuring might be needed. So I think that Guillermo is totally right that in this context, Argentina, the main problem is that lacks credibility, okay? And this has an implication that Argentina, whenever decides to tackle its problems, it needs to produce results very quickly. In the current situation, there is no room for gradualism. So the current situation is different than 2016, and even in 2016 was a mistake being too gradual, okay? Argentina lacks an anchor today. So, the monetary and exchange rate framework today cannot provide a credible anchor under any of the systems that we are discussing without a significant fiscal consolidation, okay? It is funny that the IMF, in its latest report, argues that the fund program is the anchor in Argentina, which is not, okay? And I will talk a little bit about it, okay? Really, in Argentina, the only anchor that exists, that has to exist today, is the fiscal one, okay? And so let's talk a little bit about the fiscal. What is the current situation? Well, in this light program that the IMF set up, the fiscal targets are a primary deficit of 2.5% of GDP, which I agree with Guillermo that is more likely to end up being 3 this year, and an overall deficit of 4.1, considering the cash interest or interest payments on the debt, which certainly are very low because of the 2020 restructuring, which are around 1.6% of GDP, but they are going to grow over 3% of GDP very soon, okay? Moreover, the central bank has issued debt to essentially absorb or to sterilize money financing of the deficit in the order of 12% of GDP. And this is generating currently, according to the fund, a quasi-fiscal deficit of 4.2% of GDP, okay? So once you add up the 4.1 plus 4.2, you're at 8.3, okay? And essentially, the fund thinks that the fiscal adjustment has to be very, very gradual, you see. The gross public debt, including the central bank debt, exceeds 80% of GDP. If you think of 2001, when Argentina had one of its defaults, the debt to GDP ratio was 53% of GDP, and in 2000 was 42% of GDP, okay? So Argentina cannot, 2 minutes, oh, come on. Okay, so Argentina tolerates much lower levels of debt, so it needs to have to move very fast to a primary surplus of 2% of GDP at least, okay? And moreover, the fiscal consolidation has to happen mostly or all of it through expenditure reduction. Argentina has now expenditure of GDP and tax pressure of GDP twice the level that existed in the 1990s, okay? So it needs to be able to reduce that significantly, not only to reverse the deficit, but also to be able to reduce a lot of distortionary taxation that exists today. On the issue whether this inflation can be gradual or not, I think that you correctly relate that to the inertia that exists in high inflation economies. And certainly, you know, the less credible a program is, the more inertia you will have, and the slower you will converge. Okay, so the issue is, and in this is very important, the behavior of unions in terms of wage pressures. And if you look in Argentina, the behavior of unions depends a lot on the political situation. And I think that the nice thing is that in 2023, the opposition is likely to win elections, but not only that, is very likely to get control of the two chambers of Congress. So this would be the first time since 1983 that you have a non-Peronist government with control of Congress, which implies that the next government will have an ability, a capacity to implement very significant reforms from the start. But of course, we don't know who will represent the opposition. Okay. If this happens, I think that the unions are going to probably be constructive in terms of wage negotiations, although they will not necessarily be constructive on other issues which are economically important for them. Okay. So in this, I think that if we have a very strong fiscal consolidation, I think inertia should be low. And I think that Argentina could actually go to low inflation fairly quickly. I think that this, in my view, I have more the view of convertibility, the convertibility plan, where inflation converged to low levels very rapidly, because really all contracts are very short term. So things can actually move very fast. A central issue of why I think that the IMF really didn't understand well the dynamic of domestic debt in Argentina is that when you look at the fiscal targets, those imply, and if you assume that you are not going to finance with money creation, the amount of debt that the government needs to issue exceeds completely the capacity of the local institutional investors to buy that debt. So what happened a couple of months ago with a crisis in the domestic debt market was totally foreseeable. And that actually led to the central bank buying bonds, printing money that way, which actually for the fund apparently is not printing money to finance the deficit, because they only look at the account adelantos transitorios. Okay. So I think that the fiscal consolidation is, without the fiscal consolidation, we are moving in the direction of another domestic debt crisis, where domestic debt is shorter and shorter in terms of maturity. It provides this dual remuneration to the holder in terms of the best of the devaluation or price increases. Okay. Let me, before I finish, Argentina needs to eliminate pretty rapidly the capital controls. Today, the discussion about the unification of the exchange rate is a little bit absurd. The government is actually devaluing at 100% per year, but it says that it cannot unify because it doesn't want to devalue. Okay, so 100% apparently is not devaluation for the government. While really what the government would gain by devaluing or by unifying the exchange rate is probably a much a much lower inflation in the future, less pressure on interest rates, even though in the short term, there might be some increase in inflation, okay? And this would be also the way in which to reverse all of these measures of import restrictions and multiple currency practices, which essentially will destroy economic activity, will lower economic activity. So all of that will, and Argentina will certainly get recover international reserves under that. One comment on the central bank independence. I think that it's a little bit overstated, especially when we talk of central bank independence from the legal point of view. Okay, I think that you have to have independence as a policy decision of the government. Okay, and Argentina had independence in the 90s. I think that there was a little bit of a mistake in the first IMF program, where Argentina was thinking that by passing a law, they would become independent, while the central bank was actually pretty independent until 2017, where the president of the central bank didn't like that the government would change the inflation target. Okay, but I think that what needs to happen is that the Central Bank of Argentina needs to go back to the Charter of 1992, which essentially severed completely the relationship between the central bank and the treasury in terms of financing, and limited that to a very transparent rule. I think that would be certainly necessary. Well, let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For us to gain time, I think we should, and to give you a chance to react to the discussants, why don't we take 2 questions at the same time, and then you can answer to the discussants, and everyone can answer the questions, and then we could have our coffee break.
Yeah, Guillermo, thanks both of you for the 3 of you for the presentation. I have a question. In the opposition, there's a lot of talk about restructuring these the domestic debt, partly related to the issue about the liabilities of the central bank and the explosive path in which they're in. Do you think restructuring the domestic debt would play a constructive role in your adjustment process? And yeah, that's basically the question.
And if we could take a second question, and then we can answer.
Thank you very much for the 3 presenters and for the reminder of the transition of the Real Plan was very, very interesting. Guillermo, it seems to me that the core of the problem for Argentina for a long time has been the fiscal, right? Even during convertibility, the problem was fiscal in the end. And can you elaborate a little bit more about the fiscal? How do you, because it's relatively easy to say, right? We have a fiscal adjustment, and in the process, it's not just the central government. As you said, it's a government that doubled the size of the state in 20 years. How do you bring it back to a reasonable size, and that transition? You would have to fire hundreds of thousands of workers. And if you can talk about the political dynamics of that, because it seems to me that's the core of the issue.
Everybody. Okay, so I think Monica nailed it right in the head. I have in mind something that is a sort of a streamlined real plan, and that sort of fiscal adjustment comes first, realignment of relative prices comes relatively early. You pre-announce what you're planning on doing. You sort of build the momentum of reforms ahead. In Brazil, it didn't take very long, because basically fiscal consolidation really gets started in mid-1993, and the real plan gets launched it gets the URVs introduced on March 1st of 1994. So this was in a very long period of time, and they undertook a meaningful fiscal consolidation there. So that's kind of the first part of the real plan. Then there's this URV beautiful, beautiful trick that they undertake, and something that neither Monica nor myself emphasize. In my mind, the key of the URB to break with the inertia, whatever remaining price inertia the economy had. Remember, Brazil had an inflation rate of about 40% when the real plan, monthly, 40% monthly when they launched the real plan. So it's hard to believe that you have sticky prices, right? But what you had at the time was a set of contracts that were being indexed, and there was a staggering of those contracts such that you did index a contract, and then it lasted for a little while. And another contract sort of realized that they need for the price setting. So the beauty of the URB is this daily monetary reform to the virtual currency that can collapse basically all the to a every time done daily basis. And of course, they did it wasn't perfectly clean because they needed to get involved in reforming, the government. That's what the will say. So they needed to get the union to agree to the indexation instead of taking place to the full indexation. It would go to halfway the level of. They needed to work hard, make it work for a little while. So that was a heavy index system with 40% inflation. Today, on the final day of the real plan of the URV, the final day of the URV, final day, the first day of the program, that day indexation died. You indexed to have an instant indexation almost on a daily basis, and then zero, boom. And that de-indexation, because all prices were being set at the same time and everybody was sort of indexing, when you got to a point where everything was nominal and now the economy was moving all together, you brought it down to zero. And that day you got stability. Okay, so up to that point, you didn't have any stability because prices in Cruzeiro Real, which was the unit that you were using to transact, were still growing 45% per month. All right, but then on the day after, when you kill the Cruzeiro Real and now you had the Real, that day there was no more indexation. All prices had been reset, and now you started with zero inflation. So the inertia that was left was very, very limited. And this is a beautiful thing that I think needs to be thought about. The second thing that the Real did, and that is a luxury that Brazil had, is they had $45 billion of international reserves on the day they launched the Real. Okay, Argentina will not come anywhere close to having real 45 billion on the day of stabilization. So they managed to actually use the exchange rate as an anchor. Okay, so they anchored things with the exchange rate. They didn't need to have a monetary policy anchor as they launched the Real. Now, on the first day of the Real, the actual Real after the URB, they did not set a peg. They had a roof, a top for the exchange rate, but then they set a monetary policy rule and a set of fiscal rules after that. So what I'm advocating is we're unlikely to have the luxury of being able to set a ceiling for the exchange rate, but let's have a set of very strong rules for the response of fiscal and monetary policy to try to anchor expectations so that on the day after you transition, on the day after all the recontracting has taken place, you have a more credible system. So that is, in terms of my reaction to what Monica was saying, is this idea of the Real, I think, is something that we need to take into account because it makes it for an easy disinflation without paying huge costs of stabilization. To Andres's point about what the opposition is thinking about in terms of the domestic debt, I don't know. I'm not working with any of the candidates with the opposition, but I know what I think about it. And what I think about it, and I'm need to restructure any of this debt. Now, think about what's happening now with this quasi-fiscal. If you look at the central bank, okay, if you look at this 12% of GDP that I argue is the stock of central bank debt, interest-bearing debt, it has grown near over 90% in the year to date. Basically, in the 9 months until the end of September, 90% growth in this interest-bearing account. Of that 90%, 50 points are explained by the interest rate. 40 points are explained by the type of shenanigans that Paulo was describing in terms of buying government debt, providing financing to the treasury through other tricks, and so on. So 40 points of that is of 12% of GDP is a large number. It's much bigger than the 1.5% that they committed with the IMF. So they are still doing this. If they continue to do this for a long time, then we're going to have a problem. Of an are not growing, the pay equivalent to the monetary liabilities of the central bank. If the monetary liabilities of the central bank are growing, that includes the interest bearing plus the monetary base, is growing slightly less than inflation. So what you have is that now inflation is basically wiping out a big part of this. And the interest component of this debt is actually gone, is in real terms is basically zero. Okay, so think about what you are, where you are now. You're gotten to a point where you don't need to provide monetary financing to the central bank because you've done the fiscal homework, and I'll get to that. You've done the fiscal homework. You don't need to do anything more on that side. So all you have now is a nominal interest rate that is mostly reflective of inflation. Your real interest rate, I kept it very low, very close to the US. And I'm going to use seniorage to pay for that. So the rest, through the monetary reform, I wipe out. Okay, so on the day after I go through the recontracting, you have a position in which you can actually bring nominal interest rates down from 100% to basically 5% or whatever it needs to be at the time. Okay, so you can wipe out the dynamics of the growth with that, and there's no need to restructure this. The banking system to destroy the little intermediation that you have in the domestic economy. You can keep it going without an. Therefore, my gut is that when we get to that point, the opposition is going to see they're going to chicken out at the top of. And I said, no, you know what? It makes more sense to undertake of reforms. And it's is the billion-dollar question. How do you conduct the fiscal adjustment? There's a reason why I concentrated on the monetary reform, and that is because it's easy, okay? And the fiscal is really, really, really tough, okay? So how do you do it? Well, Pablo and I are advocating for 5 points of fiscal adjustment in a year for primary, give or take, okay? So he's saying bring the primary to 2%, which is basically the same level I'm advocating. We start from -3. That's it, bingo, 5 points of GDP. Well, 3.1 is the subsidy bill for tariffs, okay? Now, you may not be able to bring that down all the way to 0, but let's assume that you get there. So you've done 3 points of GDP with tariffs. Then you have to, hopefully, it depends on the Supreme Court and on the political will. We will see. Then you have 2 points of GDP of additional adjustment that you need. You have something initially until your structural reforms start paying off. A little bit on Social Security, issues that you can clean up here and there. And a little bit on transfers to provinces that you may be able to do. All of that is temporary. All of that is really not particularly strong in terms of long-term commitments, but you probably need to do that. And in the middle, you're definitely going to need to have this important agreement with provinces. A big of those explanation for the growth in spending is Social Security. Another big part is provinces. A big part of the growth to the 45% in government expenditures is provinces. You're going to need provinces to sort of pitch in. So that there's a lot of political work that needs to be done, and it's not easy. Now, in my line of defense, to my proposal, you're going to need to do that with any stabilization plan that you want. And without that, well, Argentina will continue to be Argentina, right? A fun country to talk about in a seminar like this.
Thank you so much. So if you're interested in hearing what the next government should do, that's our next panel. After we have a 10-minute coffee break, our next panel is reform and stabilization. What should the next government do? So please
Yep.
stay
Here
here,
we go.
have some coffee, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Hello? No. Can, yeah, we should start the final session. Please take a seat.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on reform and stabilization. What should the next government do? My name is Maral Shamlu, and I'm honored and delighted to be moderating this panel, hosting our distinguished guests. Before we begin, allow me to quickly tell you how we will organize the session. I will ask our panelists to discuss their views on the topic of the panel. I will ask them question to motivate their 15-minute intervention, and then I'll just open the floor to questions. Our panelists don't need an introduction today, but let me just refresh our memories to their journeys that have brought them here today. On the screen, we have Mr. Domingo Cavallo, who was Argentina's Minister of Economy from 1991 to 1996, and then again in 2001, and Minister of Foreign Affairs between 89 and 91. He was elected National Congressman on 2 occasions, and also served as Chairman of the Central Bank of Argentina Republic in 1982. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Guillermo Ortiz is currently Senior Advisor and Board Member of BTG Pactual and former Chairman of BTG Pactual Latin America ex-Brazil. He was Governor of Banco de Mexico from January 1998 to 2009, and from 1994 to 1997. Mr. Ortiz served also as the Secretary of Finance and Public Credit in the Mexican federal government. In addition, he served on the board of several international organizations, in IMF, the World Bank, and IADB, as well as the BIS. Thank you for joining us. Then I have the pleasure of welcoming Lisa Schindler, who is a Managing Director for Standard & Poor's Global Ratings. Ms. Schindler is a lead analyst in sovereign and international public finance ratings for Americas, responsible for key credits such as Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. She has worked in the international finance division of the Federal Reserve Board, and also at Exxon Company International. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Alejandro Werner, the founding member of Georgetown Americas Institute, who has kindly organized this event. He's a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute, and completed recently a 9-year stint as the director of Western Hemisphere Department at the IMF. Prior to that appointment, he was Under Secretary of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico's Finance Ministry, and held several positions in that ministry and the central bank. Thank you, Alejandro, for being here and for organizing this event. All right, let me begin handing the floor to our distinguished guest. I would like to start with you, Mr. Domingo Cavallo. If I may address everybody by their first names on the panel, if you don't mind. I would love to hear, as a way to sort of motivate our discussion on the panel, given your experience, and how would you think about convincing the population, or creating a consensus in Argentina to the necessity of reforms? We saw in Latin America, after the turbulent 80s and 90s, most countries managed to create this consensus. Why is it so hard in Argentina, and how would you go about doing that?
Actually, it is not too hard. In the 90s, of course, the 80s were very turbulent in Argentina. Actually, there had been 15 years of stagflation, and in no one of those years, between 1975 and 1990, inflation had been below 100%, and the economy was with ups and downs, and it was stagnant. So it was a stagflation, and ended in 1989, 1990 into hyperinflation. And then we were able to implement economic and political reform program that eliminated inflation for 10 years. And the economy grew. In the first 4 years, from 91 to 94, it expand 34% in the GDP. And then we had the impact of the tequila crisis. We had 1 year of recession, but in 96 we were already expanding again, and we did so until 1998. Then we entered into a period of recession that, as a consequence of the monetary system we had, transforms itself into a depression because it was associated with deflation. But I want to explain why during the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s of the 21st century, we had a complete reversal of the reforms that had been implemented during the 90s. And this is important to interpret in general the economic history of Argentina. The inflationary tax in the past, before the launching of the convertibility plan in 91, for many, many decades, had been collected, the inflationary tax had been collected by the government to finance the deficit, but at the same time, it has been collected by the private sector because many, many enterprises, those that were able to get financing from the banking system, committed to pay a nominal interest rate that after a while, and particularly because of the decisions of the government on the exchange rate and the inflation, those interest rates became negative. And so inflation provided a way for the private sector to get rid of their debts. That is to default on the private sector debt. At the same time that the government was defaulting also on its debt in local currency. And of course, when the government and also the private sector accumulated debt in dollars in those years, from time to time they defaulted, particularly the public sector, on that debt. So that so inflation, in a sense, devaluation and inflation was a mechanism to generate default on the domestic debt and on the foreign debt of both the private sector and the public sector. So, of course, the convertibility plan, which was much more than the convertibility plan, because actually, President Menem's government, from the very beginning, had very clear plans on the opening up of the economy and the establishing a new relationship with the world. I was a foreign minister at the beginning, but at the same time, he was conscious that it was necessary to introduce a reform of the state, and of course, to deregulate or to introduce big changes in the organization of the economy. When we implemented the convertibility plan and suddenly we eliminated inflation, the government got a huge popular support. It started to win every election. But what it was important from the economic point of view is that facilitated the implementation of all those reforms. We would not have succeeded in privatizing public enterprises that generated a 10% of GDP of fiscal deficit because of their losses and also of their investment, which were very inefficient, and of course provided very bad services. So, but we could complete the privatization, and the privatization were conducted previous design of rules of the game that would introduce competition and transparency in such a way that there would be no economic subsidies to be paid to the private sector to maintain investment in infrastructure. And so it was a huge reform. The same for promoting exports in general, particularly of the agribusiness and agriculture. We eliminated export taxes. There was, and what was important, we deregulated the economy. We eliminated a lot of regulations. We could do that precisely because the population supported all those reforms, even though it meant to reduce employment in the public enterprises that were privatized by 500 million people. So I think the fact that we had one decade free of inflation and in general rapid growth and a modernization of the economy was not only the effect of the monetary reform. And actually the monetary reform was not so original. Actually, Argentinians had already decided to use the dollar for not only for transaction, but mainly for their to protect their savings at the time of the hyperinflation. What we did was to say, okay, you can use the dollar. The dollar has the same status as the local currency. And with the idea that maybe one day our local currency could be a credible one and would be demanded by the people, we created it as a convertible currency using the currency board approach. But that was marginal. Actually, if we had not let the economy to be dollarized, nobody would have believed that the currency board would be maintained over time. And so I really don't, and of course, we could have dollarized fully, but I don't think that the effect on the economy, immediate effect, and also medium and long-term effect would have been different. Of course, I understand very well the insistence of Emilio of trying to offer a monetary solution that makes reversal less likely. But you know, what the new authorities that took power in 2002 did with the currency, it could have done even if the economy were fully dollarized. Because what happened in 2002 or at the end of 2001? You know, Argentina had accumulated savings, significant savings that were in the hands of the private sector that had deposited their dollars and pesos, but mainly by the end of the decade were mostly dollars in the banking system. And of course, there were also reserves back in the monetary base. And there were savings in the pension funds, and there had been a huge investment in infrastructure. So there were capacity to produce electricity, gas, natural gas, transport. So that was the situation of the economy. There was a recession that was becoming a sort of depression because of the fact that we could not stimulate domestic demand by using monetary policy or through a devaluation. And then it came the new authorities. What was the decision of the new authorities? The decision was to use all the savings to solve the problems, the debt problem of the provinces, basically, and not so much of the federal government, and of the private sector, who was indebted in dollars. Of course, the industrialists, the big debtors of the private sector, applauded it. But what was the mechanism? A devaluation? No, the devaluation would have been marginal. The mechanism was the pesofication, that is, the forced conversion of all assets and liabilities from dollars, which there were assets of the private sector in dollar terms in the order of $70 billion. Of course, they were in Argentina, in the Argentinian banks, and they were converted into pesos. Suddenly, of course, people found that instead of having dollars, they had pesos, a huge amount of pesos that they didn't want. Of course, they tried to convert again those pesos into dollars in the free market for dollars, and that generated the devaluation that was the price of the dollar jumped from 1 to 4. Now, was that necessary to take the country out of the recession? Not at all. In fact, during the first semester of 2002, all the problems, if recession, unemployment, poverty increased, and in addition, inflation was reintroduced into the economy. Now, what happened? Why the governments, the populist government that followed, not only the one that replaced De La Rúa, I mean, not only Dualde, but then the Kirchner, and I would say to some extent also Macri's government, they thought that they had enough savings available to finance a huge expansion of the government and give benefits to the people, distributing the past savings. The first movement in that direction was the pesofication, that took all the deposits or a portion of the deposit of the public sector, of the private sector, to cancel debt of the corporation, of the private sector. And then the government used the pension funds, and every reserves of the central bank, everything, to finance a huge increase in government spending. And of course, finally, those government spendings generated a huge deficit. And the question is that now, and that is a reason why I am optimistic, now there are no more savings available to be captured by populist government to finance any kind of expansion of the public sector or even providing benefits to parts of the private sector. All those savings have exhausted. Where are those savings? Now they are outside Argentina. Argentinians, with the experience of the previous confiscations of deposits and all that, decided to send their money abroad in dollars, of course. And that is why, as Emilio showed, now Argentina has a huge amount of dollars, but not in Argentina, not ready to finance investment or operation of the Argentinian economy. So what is the solution? First of all, to be optimistic, there are no more ways of financing high expanding misallocation of resources. The new government will have, and I think the opposition is now coming to this conclusion, will have to tackle the real problem. For example, many of those companies that had been privatized and that had been no source of deficit in the 90s had been nationalized again, and now are generating $5 billion of fiscal deficit. That has to be reversed. And many other reforms, particularly in the provinces that have expanded expanding significantly, and all that has to be tackled. Now, and to come to the stabilization plan, I think that it is necessary to have a stabilization plans capable of producing immediate effect, to get support of the people and to have arguments, the leaders of the country, to implement the very difficult reforms that need to be implemented in order to make that stabilization sustainable over time. So I think the idea that Emilio brought here, and also the ideas that Guillermo exposed, in my opinion, are very useful and should be explained to the future leaders of the country and the economic teams that are working with them in order to have these ideas as ingredient to design a stabilization plan. But as the key, as Pablo said, is the fiscal adjustment, the realignment of relative prices, the deregulation of the economy, the opening up of the economy, in order to be able to do all that and to get popular support to make all those reforms, the new government has to be effective in delivering a significant stabilization or reduction in inflation as soon as possible when it starts governing. Not to avoid all the adjustments, but to create a climate, the popular support, to be able to implement the adjustments. No? Why I think at this time, a government that does this, I mean that implements a reform of the state, an opening up of the economy, a deregulation, a process of reprivatization as we did in the 90s. Of course, at the same time that they create a climate of stability, will be able to maintain that over time and to avoid something like what happened in 2002. Because I think that this time it will be very difficult to get financing for just accumulation of capital abroad. I think it will be necessary to use it for the financing the investment and the growth and increasing productivity of the economy. It will not be easy, but in my view, the political situation, political climate, it will be favorable to implement this kind of reform.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that intervention. It was extremely helpful. Just to being conscious of time, I want to give a chance to our other guests to also discuss some of these issues. So, Guillermo, turning to you, given your role in the 1995 and the fact crisis in Mexico and the lessons that you think are important for Argentina or can be learned. In the run-up to the 1995 crisis, the peg, the peso peg had been an important anchor, and that had been credited with bringing down inflation. It had been credited with attracting capital inflows. When the crisis hit, were you tempted? Did you consider a dollarization or repeg? And if so, what were the arguments that sort of won the day and made the government decide to let the peso float freely?
Well, thank you. And I want to thank Alejandro for the opportunity of being here and listening to all these very interesting talks about Argentina. As Monica said, you know, this is a fascinating economic experiment, unrunning for many years, for decades. And but let me start by recalling a panel discussion in 1995 with Domingo Cavallo and Pedro Malem in Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? I mean, I don't remember, but this was the annual meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank. Yeah? So what were we doing in Jerusalem? I have no idea. Yeah? But there we were. And it was useful also actually because you know, we're in the middle of the Mexican crisis, and I could go to the Muro de las Lamentaciones and the Mezquita and the Holy Cross. So I did the whole you know tour in Jerusalem of the holy sites of the different religions, you know. But anyway, yeah. So in this particular, I mean, this was in April '95. So we were in the middle of the Mexican crisis, no? And Domingo was very very forceful in the panel, saying that you know, Argentina was in a much stronger position than Mexico because, as it was mentioned by Guillermo and others, you know, the tequila crisis had a really huge impact in Argentina. I think deposits went down like 20% in a matter of weeks, and you had a run on the banks and so on. So it was a pretty tough moment, and so I concluded saying that I totally agreed with Domingo that Argentina was in a much stronger position, but Domingo kept, you know, he kept referring to the Mexican crisis as the tequila crisis, you know, and I objected to that because I told Domingo, you are giving a good drink a bad name. But it stuck, and now it's a tequila crisis. No? But anyway, you know, I was going to fast forward to the 2018 program, but I will skip that part because it's so well known. The only thing that I would say regarding that is that I spoke to the new team in charge of the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, and the program was well designed, but I think it was, you know, serious program and so on. The thing I didn't understand is how can you implement an inflation targeting regime without a fiscal anchor? Because the fiscal anchor, I mean, the fiscal policy was supposed to be gradual. So my comment was, you know, I mean, you have to have a lot of luck, you know, time consistency, and, you know, a firm political commitment to this, you know, fiscal path, which in my mind seems like a very tall order. Now, the new program of the fund, and Pablo mentioned, doesn't even pretend to do that. It's just a refinancing of the obligations, you know. But let me go back to the tequila crisis. You know, in In 1993, that's a year before the crisis erupted, Mexico was doing quite well. We had just finished the negotiations of NAFTA and a series of very sensible economic reforms carried on by President Salinas at the time, made Mexico very attractive. So we had a huge influx of capital from from funds mainly in the US, but also in Europe and so on. So large capital flows, and things were looking up quite well at the end of '93. Then in '94, we had two huge shocks. One domestic, the presidential candidate Colosio was assassinated, and then Mr. Greenspan rose interest rates from 3% to 6%. And these shocks were, they took the economy off balance. We experienced a reversal of capital flows. And so we had started issuing peso bonos, which were dollar-denominated, dollar-indexed, Mexican obligations. And we issued a lot of that because that was a substitute, for intervening with reserves. So by the end of '94, essentially the central bank had run out of reserves, and we had to act very quickly. We got a huge, financing package at the time, amounting to almost $50 billion from the IMF, the US Treasury, multilateral organizations, including the BIS, which was mostly window dressing, the last $5 billion. But anyway, we put together that package, and then we did a very drastic, adjustment program. The fiscal deficit was running around 5% of GDP, more or less the same as the current account deficit. And just to make it short, we ended up that in '95 with a current account balance in equilibrium, and we adjusted the fiscal accounts by almost 5% of GDP. So in essence, it was a shock therapy. Front-loaded shock therapy, and we remember, the mantra was we have to overdo it. We have to overshoot both in financing and adjustment. And it was shock therapy. I mean, the GDP fell more than 6%, 6.5% 6.8% in '95, and real wages dropped 30%. I mean, that was brutal, and it took years to recover. So, I mean, that was really tough. I mean, we raised the value-added tax from 10 to 15%. We raised the prices of electricity, the whole works, it was a brutal adjustment. And as a consequence, we lost, I mean, the party, the PRI, lost Congress that year, and then they lost the presidential election the following in 2000. But anyway, this is in a nutshell, the problem. Of course, the question that you asked, and we didn't really know what to do with exchange rate, because at the time there was no experience of any emerging market with a floating exchange rate system, and we had, I think, the central bank, one of the board members was very, very keen on pushing for a currency board or dollarization. And we had an Argentinian advisor, I think it was Ricardo Arrazu, who who was a friend of Paco Gil, you remember Paco, and anyway, so so we had a couple of sessions on that at the cabinet level, and I was deadly opposed to it. And I told President Cedillo, look, I'm not going to go on with this. If you think that this is something that is doable in Mexico, you have to look for somebody else to implement it, because I'm not going to do it. Anyway, it was discussed, and there was a big fight. I was at the Ministry of Finance then. I didn't know I was going to be at central bank 3 years later, but the issue was precisely that there was a huge amount of volatility. How do you stabilize a foreign exchange market which has become totally unanchored with no reserves and no prospect for acquiring substantial amount of reserves? So we of course propitiated the creation of a futures market in Chicago for the peso, and eventually, as the economy got squeezed, the program started working. I mean, it was, as I mentioned, it was just shock treatment. Boom. And the good part is that we regain access to international capital markets fairly soon, and we managed to repay the US and the fund much earlier in advance. And the economy rebounded the following year to the sort of pre-crisis level in 96. So GDP fell 7% in 95, and then it rose 7% in 96. But of course, the cost in terms of real wages, and it was brutal. So that was the episode of the. And to your question about whether we considered, going back to sort of prefixed rates, of course we did. I mean, when I was finance minister then, and I remember writing we had to write something called the National Development Plan, which was not a development plan at all. Remember, el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo. And I wrote, we will continue to float until we have enough reserves and then can migrate to a more predictable exchange rate system. But, after a few months, volatility was substantially reduced because, I mean, the fiscal part was really biting. And the huge problem that was created, we had a broken banking system, because in the previous year, with financial deregulation and poor supervision, with the banks nationalized, the credit expanded brutally. So we had, on top of this, currency crisis, we had a huge banking crisis. All the banks went bust, and that's another story. So after we stabilized in 95, 96, we had obviously then the Asian crisis, the Brazilian shocks, and so on. But we still held, to the original framework of floating rates and fiscal discipline and so on. And then when I moved to the central bank, we started working gradually on inflation targeting. And as I think it was Guillermo mentioned, we started setting annual targets for inflation. When I moved in central bank, the inflation was, high double digits, 40-something%. And we said, next year it's going to be 25 or something, and next year it's going to be 15. And 3 or 4 years later, we converged to a formal inflation targeting regime with a band, between 3 and 4%. So it was successful in the sense that inflation, you know, by the mid 2000s, by the mid 2000s, had reached something like 5.5, 6%, and it became a stationary process. So that's a kind of short story. The other important aspect of that is that it allowed us to develop a very important peso market, yen bonds. You know? The duration of Mexican debt during 95 was 1 month, and I remember that someone mentioned, Pablo, I think it was, that the Argentinian duration is about a month. You know, that's the situation we were. Today, the average duration of Mexican debt is almost 8 years. As we have a very well-defined curve for up to 30 years with a pension fund reform, and I don't want to go into that because that's a long story. But let me just conclude by saying that you know, the system has proven to be very resilient. This monetary framework, and in contrast to most emerging markets, the peso has been floating mostly freely for this whole period. We have intervened in the foreign exchanges from time to time. During the great financial crisis, for example, the peso depreciated like 50% at one point, but the inflation went up to less than 7. You know, it jumped from 4 point something to 2 points. You know? So expectations did not unanchored. So that was a resilience proof, you know, of the exchange rate system and the banking system. And perhaps the other test of resiliency has to do with our current government, which has done an incredible amount of damage to the economy, to institutions, and so on. And yet the country has resisted. I mean, partly because despite the president is obviously a populist, he's a rare breed of populism, you know, because he's a fiscally responsible populist. That's almost an oxymoron, okay? But that's we have strange things in Latin America, you know, and we breed strange creatures. So the real economic puzzle is why Mexico hasn't grown. You know? I mean, like the rest of Latin America, mediocre growth. Mexico opened up the economy. I mean, NAFTA was a big success, and you know, listening to the discussion on dollarization and that you have to import some anchors, you have to import some schemes, you know, to gain credibility. NAFTA played that role for us in a sense, because it set rules of the game, you know, over a long horizon, and it's been very successful. So this is a paradox, you know. Mexico's manufacturing exports are about 85–90% of total exports. They're 40% of GDP. We are the main trading partner with the US now. And the export mix is quite sophisticated. Mexico is the 8th largest producer of telecommunications equipment, you know, almost as much as US. In terms of economic complexity, Mexico ranks 16 among the OECD tables on economic complexity. So Mexico, you know, has become a sort of sophisticated producer, exporter of manufactured goods, and yet growth is abysmal. But that's a story for another chapter here. So let me conclude on this note.
Thank you very much. It's actually a great question, and I hope we can come back to it in the question and answers. But it's important to put a marker there. Thank you, Lisa. If I may turn to you. So, you know, as somebody who looks at the entire Latin America, I think we all agree that macroeconomic stability is a necessary condition for, sort of generating consistent GDP growth, etc. But as Guillermo just pointed out, it's not clearly a sufficient condition. Mexico has provided macroeconomic stability, yet has not managed to create growth. So what do you think are the other sort of important ingredients in this? And particularly in the case of Argentina, what do you think as the top priorities outside macroeconomic stability?
Thank you so much. And thanks, Alex, for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to be with such an incredible panel. Minister Governor Ortiz highlighted a lot of the points I was going to put on the table, as well as Minister Cavallo. I think one, starting from, you say macro stability is not enough, right? But we're talking about significant instability, right? And so I think that's another extreme that differentiates Argentina from a lot of the region. And certainly from, even though Mexico doesn't grow, Brazil doesn't grow. And I'll kind of put some comparisons on the table with both of those countries. They're also, and I'm also going to put it from the lens of, as coming from a rating agency, kind of using some of the construct, the way we kind of look down at things. Noting that we don't give policy advice, and as Alex would long discuss with us, what might be good for the rating may not be good for policy or the economy as well. But and you're talking about Argentina at the very low end of the spectrum, Brazil's in middle spec grade, and Mexico and the other key economies in LATAM are in the triple B category. So pretty solid. I think cannot underestimate, when I step back and look at Argentina, the lack of policy predictability, the lack of policy consistency, macro and micro. And Minister Cavallo highlighted the swings in policy that we've seen through the decades in terms of within a Peronist government to a different Peronist government, the role of the state, the role versus the role of the private sector, regulation, et cetera, the form of the monetary policy construct, that those swings in policy, I think, are so detrimental and undermine any prospect of, I think, potentially trying to build that political consensus, which is really key, and then kind of sort of a level field for growth. And I think the challenge today is you see the divisions, and you look at today in Argentina within the government itself, within the ruling coalition, and divisions within the opposition. And that feeds into the uncertainties that plague the near term and longer term outlook at the moment. So I think that is so profound that it's hard to get away from that. And if you take the case of Peru, right? You had PPK to President Fiscal, to 3-4 presidents, and now President Castillo, going from PPK to President Castillo in impeachment proceedings. But there's still that anchor of a policy there on the macro side. And somewhat on the micro side. Again, and Peru doesn't grow, it doesn't grow as robustly as it might, but it's not as, its track record is stronger than, say, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And so I think there's some anchor there in political consensus, notwithstanding swings in administrations and the economy, and so many changes from, over the years before the intense back and forth in the recent 5 years, but that you had time to build a ground of macro is going to be there. And there's still, the challenges with informality and not growing high at faster rates, et cetera. But I think that's really an important thing to highlight. The next piece, I think, comes back to when I'm sitting at Argentina, such a profound weakness, the lack of its own currency, the lack of the inability, the Argentines don't view the peso as a store of value. And swinging to the rating construct, you've got institutional predictability, policies, right? That's key anchor, monetary policy, the exchange rate framework, and stability, low inflation, but the depth of markets, all the points that were highlighted in Mexico's case. And even in Brazil's case, right? So we're having much weaker fiscal story there, but the region moved towards the floating exchange rate regimes and inflation targeting that has provided policy flexibility. And when I sat becoming the quote unquote analyst for Argentina for the first time, as opposed to just a voting member of our discussions, what struck me in a different way was there's no currency. And when I look at having been also the analyst for the US, the exorbitant privilege that provides flexibility for the US, notwithstanding its fiscal story, comes from the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency. So it's sort of it struck me, it's the complete flip side for Argentina. And I think that permeates the fiscal dynamics, the external dynamics, and then of course the gross dynamics in such a profound way, it's hard to extract that. And the changes in governments that Minister Ortiz highlighted in Mexico, Mexico is an anchor. And notwithstanding all the noise under the current administration, well, if you're going to change all the board, et cetera, but you're still that mandate, and the broader political consensus is there to follow that mandate, that new governors who may have had different views and not ahead of time, that's following it. We can talk about hawks, doves, what have you, but I think that is so crucial. So those are so fundamental, both of them, that I think those are key pieces. Then you can talk about, within the economic realm, clearly, the challenges in the construct of the tax, the level of the tax base as spending has risen in Argentina over the recent decades, but also the composition of the tax base. With, over 160 taxes at least several years ago, overlapping at local government levels, the distortionary components in the export sector, VAT, what have you. And that is also a problem for Brazil. So I think that's where you have that parallel, not just the order of magnitude, but how the tax base is, the construct of it, that's certainly a weight for decades on Brazil's growth story as well. So I think that's a key piece there. Openness in terms of broader trade relations. Also, I'll say, like Brazil, very low level of exports plus imports as a share of GDP. And that is where I think there's significant opportunity, if one would think, in Argentina, given, we will highlight Vaca Muerta, et cetera, but that even though it's significant advances, it's 7% of exports. But if we think back how the soy and ag complex grew with a lot of policies on the ground ahead of time, I think that's where that hope comes. But that's infrastructure, it's regulation, it's sense that you can get your money out of the country, and et cetera. So those, I don't really know if that consider that micro or macro, but policies to foster that more outward orientation and a diversification of that outward orientation. I think those are big things that, that come to mind. Clearly labor market regulations, and one can talk about of course, across the region as well, that weighs on growth. Within the fiscal accounts themselves, obviously, there's no track record, there's no anchor, so credibility there is key. But then if we're looking inside the accounts, right, what weighs is the structure in terms of pensions, 40% or so of spending, and the shift in the pension policies that we've seen over the recent decades, right? And obviously transfers, slash subsidies. And that we also see elsewhere in the region. So we can put those policies on the table of what need to be adjusted. And I see those as important for the growth story because it's a confidence shock, right? I think that it's a credibility and policy story, even though what's called the micro macro, it's sort of macro, but they feed to me into the micro dynamics of just a couple of examples. And it's those same challenges in Brazil, but the important difference goes back to the currency, right? Brazil doesn't have the external vulnerability that Argentina does. And that's where, in part, because there's a credible currency, a credible central bank that has been able to provide, kind of navigate the dynamics. And that's where I go back to the currency piece. To me is so critical because it permeates the vulnerabilities in, frankly, across the pieces that we would look at when we come to the ratings puzzle. Let me stop there because, given the time, et cetera.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Alejandro, coming to you. I was reading she had this piece on what were the mistakes of the country, and she mentioned lack of any progress on structural reform and fiscal stabilization, the two main ones. Did we learn anything from those mistakes? Did we at least hopefully make new mistakes rather than the old ones? What is your assessment of the first program, obviously, where we go further?
Look, I think, I mean, the program that the IMF did with the macro administration in Argentina, I mean, there was an evaluation by the fund. We can actually say that there were maybe program design issues and also program implementation issues. But it was a risky program. I mean, it was 2 years into an administration facing a very contested election. And if you push me, I would say that it was a bridge to minimize financial instability, to be able for Argentina to complete, for the macro administration to complete its administration, then for a new government to really launch a much more aggressive program, whoever that administration would have been. What happened is that administration came, that, I mean, Lisa was talking about policy uncertainty, but an administration came that doesn't have a policy. I mean, it's not even uncertainty. I mean, it's just pure discretion and basically politics ahead of policies. I mean, there's no social objective that they try to achieve in a policy plan to increase the welfare of the population beyond keeping themselves in power. And so given that, maybe the program should have had at one stage in the election year some type of capital controls or something to withstand the volatility of the demand for local assets under a political uncertainty that you cannot control with interest rates. I mean, if you are actually expecting a government like the one that actually come to power, the last thing you want is to be in that country holding your wealth in that country. So I think in that sense, I think we should have maybe put much more weight into that potential scenario, and then including the program much heavier suspenders and belts, etc., for this thing to hold, to live through that transition. That would be my comment to that Anne Kruger's reference. And then, I mean, kind of wrapping up this discussion, my main concern sometimes of what I'm listening is still this kind of political urgency of the next government to generate very quick results in the first 2 years, to generate some consensus. I think if that's the case, Argentina society is still not where it needs to be to implement the kind of policy reform program and stabilization program that Argentina needs. And I think that maybe during the election, the opposition should actually run with the program and actually say that it might need to be an 8-year program. I mean, Argentina will not be fixed in 3 years, nor in 4 years. And stabilization, as Guillermo was saying, it's not an issue that will come overnight. And if the political proposition by the opposition is to achieve a quick win, you will get into a timing consistency issue that I think it was mentioned by Guillermo. Okay, let's assume you're able to reduce inflation very, very fast in 2 years. Supposedly, because that will generate the political consensus to make the reforms, I'm pretty sure you will not do the reforms. You will start looking at the next election in 4 years and will say, okay, let's try to write it out, and then with the new government, we'll do the reforms. And then you fall into these problems, and that's my concern. I mean, somehow the next government will need to address Argentinian society, ask for patience, and ask for a significant consensus to launch a very aggressive program that starts with the fiscal. It starts with a much deeper structural reforms. I mean, a lot of the fiscal adjustments are basically achieved through, I mean, Argentina has huge pension payments, but then they keep themselves by increasing inflation and reducing pensions. And then when inflation comes down, pensions go up again because they have backward looking indexation. And you never end up fixing that problem with a real pension reform, with a real subsidy reform, and actually achieve the anchors, the institutional anchors that Argentina needs to move forward on the macros side. I do believe, contrary to what somebody mentioned here, that you need an independent central bank because you send a signal that this is key, and that's a little bit what Guillermo and Lisa were saying. Obviously, at the beginning, you need the institution and the people. If you don't have the independent people running the institutions, you can have a law, but nothing will happen. But then through time, you end up having better central bank governors, worse central bank governors, but the institution carries this thing forward. And you achieve a situation in which I like, I mean, Emilio's reference to Ecuador, because having worked simultaneously in Ecuador and in Argentina was a daily struggle with the exchange rate. So you were never able to get to the fundamentals because each Friday was another exchange rate crisis. And then you cannot talk about other issues. And Ecuador, we didn't have an exchange rate crisis. So we talked about labor reform, we talked about fiscal issues, etc. However, Ecuadorian society has not changed regarding fiscal issues, regarding structural issues. I mean, we haven't seen that changing consensus that maybe dollarization should bring yet. No, so I'm not fully convinced. And on the other side, you look at the other group of countries, like Guillermo was saying, dollarization was discussed in Mexico. I don't know with what level of depth, but it was not adopted. And nobody in Mexico now is thinking that we would have been better off with a dollarized economy. And I think the same is the case in Colombia or in Chile or even Brazil. No, but so that's more food for thought. But I think the references, I mean, the Ecuadorian reference is relevant, but also we have to look at the countries that did not adopt the dollarization, adopted the more patient path of bringing inflation down in a 6-year horizon, and ended up together with these pension reforms, this development of the local markets, etc., constructing a relatively stable and robust domestic currency market. No, and so I think those are all issues that have to weigh into the discussion of what Argentina will need to do starting in 2024. I would say that Argentina needs to open up its economy. I mean, you also have a government that comes convinced that, I mean, if Argentina needs to be very competitive, you need to be able to import inputs at competitive prices, and you need to put your firms in competitions with international firms. And I think, I mean, Mr. Cavallo said Argentina has to privatize. I mean, why do you have a publicly owned airline? and many other things. I think you have to really, I mean, all the things that were kind of taboo with the Macri administration, we cannot talk about adjustment. We cannot talk about privatization. We cannot talk about opening. It was kind of, all of these are bad words. Well, those are the words that need to be said, and those are the things that need to be done in Argentina. And actually, people running for government in Argentina, they better tell the public that that's what they're going to do, because if not, they're going to get into the government and they will not have a mandate to do these things. And they will end up in the same place that previous governments have ended up, in another default and hyperinflation, etc. And I think who would want to govern that country if you actually will not have the space to implement this policy? So for me, that's something that would be very important in the next election in Argentina, to be very open and clear to the Argentinian society of what needs to be done to have a shot at changing things in Argentina starting in 2024.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all. And perhaps we can spend, we're a little bit running behind, but perhaps we can spend 10 minutes for questions and answers. Maybe I can abuse my privilege and ask you, Alejandro, if somebody came up with a program like that, did we, we need 8 years to do all these difficult things, will they ever get elected?
Well, I really don't know. I'm not a politician, but at the end of the day, I think Argentina is at the moment in which somebody has to put out a platform on what they're going to do. Because I think getting to power again without the political or the mandate to do things, and thinking that sequentially you will be able to generate this consensus, I think it's a little bit of a mirage. And then you will be running into this thing of, let's try to fool the population that we're achieving something to get consensus, and then you're going to get into this time inconsistency debate. So, and I think it would, I think society would, hopefully would like somebody that is an unusual politician that tells them the truth and tells them what it needs to be done. And I think politicians have been terribly discredited in Argentina up to this point. No, I do think so. And I just don't, I also will abuse my privilege just for 1 minute. What would have happened in Argentina during the last 3 years if the current government would have continued with the adjustment that was being implemented by the Macri administration, would have restructured their private sector debt in the summer the way they did it together with the new IMF program? I'm pretty sure the IMF would have given them significant amount of additional resources because it was in the middle of the pandemic. And just add to that, I mean, very two small structural issues. I mean, just put a gas pipeline from Vaca Muerta to wherever it needs to go, Buenos Aires, etc., and maybe do the hidrovia to reduce the cost of taking out all the soy by maybe 20% by dredging the Paraná River, and a couple of other things. Today that we have a world food crisis and a world energy crisis, I think Argentina would be in a great position. And now they're actually begging for dollars from the agricultural sector. It's really a pity.
Thank you very much. Two questions. The first is, given how often as foreign investors we've been burnt in Argentina, in any adjustment program, whether as Guillermo Mondino described or your Minister Cavallo has described, would it be under much more binding external financing conditions, or do you see resources forthcoming for any, that would allow any kind of smoothing of the adjustment, given how many times and how often Argentina has burned both creditors and investors, foreign and domestic? My second question, I'm going to allow myself of no privilege, but I will still ask it, given that we have Minister Ortiz with us, whom we haven't seen in a long time. A Mexico question. NAFTA, which is an enormous success in theory, one could argue is a tremendous failure from the Mexican side. I mean, there's been no convergence, minimal, gains from trade, if any, productivity growth that has been lower than the US. It's for two economies with such drastically different factor endowments. I remember when NAFTA was signed, it was euphoric. We were expecting growth rates of 6-7% convergence in 20 years. It was the biggest bullish story. I mean, it's interesting to see it still described as a success, when from the Mexican side, you could argue it's the worst reward on a free trade agreement in history, so to speak. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? And what can you, clearly there's an opportunity for Mexico. Sorry, we're deviating a little bit, but given that you have here, given that that the offshoring situation with China, that is, there's an opportunity given the risks that emerge for companies around the world after COVID. And there's this concept of friendshoring, that companies are going to leave China to come to Mexico. What can you do to take advantage of that? Sorry for the deviation. I apologize, my Argentine friends.
¿Quieres que hable? Well, very quickly, I disagree with respect. I think NAFTA has been, a driving force in the Mexican economy, and it's been quite positive. The problem is that there are really two Mexicos. If you compare productivity levels in Monterrey, in Coahuila, and so on, they're not that different, from productivity levels in fast-growing countries in Europe. But the southern part of Mexico looks much more like Central America. So these huge regional differences, are fundamental. Second, there's a number of additional issues that have hampered economic growth. One of them, latent one, is organized crime, not only in Mexico, but also in other countries in Latin America. They are organized crime, the drug cartels and so on are becoming international organizations. You read in the papers that the Mexican cartels are associated with the Brazilians and so on. So that is a taxing thing. And also the inability of the US to form a coherent policy regarding, migration and gun control. We get literally, tens of thousands of weapons, smuggled in the border, and they're arming not only Mexican drug gangs, but drug gangs from all Latin America. I mean, this is just absolutely crazy. You can just walk up to any store across the border and buy an AK-47 and even almost a rocket launcher. I mean, this is crazy. So there's a lot of things that are happening. And the second question, very quickly, nearshoring, that's actually happening. I mean, if you look what's going on in the northern part of Mexico again, there's a bunch of companies, many of them Chinese. This is a new phenomenon. A lot of Chinese companies coming to Mexico to be protected under the NAFTA and to integrate themselves with the supply chain. And this is not because government policies are so friendly or good, this is in spite of them, so it's just almost for gravity. So let me stop here.
I guess this is a question for all the panel. How much do you think Argentina has changed a lot since the 90s, and particularly on the social and employment part of conditions of the economy? You could argue that over 40% of the population works in the informal sector, when that used to be half the size of that number. Poverty is now in the close to 40%, 30 something. Probably going up, used to be half that number. And how much do you think that conditions the process of policymaking? And so abusing of your experience in Mexico, where the tequila crisis did generate a lot of social unrest and difficulties. what lessons do you extract from that in terms of managing the transformation, like the one everybody agrees on is needed when you have these social conditions that have changed, or where Argentina has Latin Americanized so much in the last few years? And so what lessons do you extract from your own experience and what you've learned from looking at other countries can be extracted from that and can be used at the time of formulating policy?
I mean, it's hard for me. It's very hard to extrapolate from, and I wasn't in Mexico. I mean, I arrived in Mexico in '97. So a lot of the fiscal adjustment had already been made. I think it was the nicer part of the stabilization program. I mean, the effects of NAFTA were really impacting the economy, and inflation was coming down, and everything that Guillermo said was working well. And I think the structure of Mexican society and labor unions, the political structure is so different from Mexico. I mean, the PRI was losing power, but still commanded a degree of control over key sectors that were your counterparts in negotiations. That in Argentina, it's not the case. My experience in Argentina during the Macri administration is that it was very hard to get agreements that were socially desirable, even with the private sector, and things that, given the Mexican political structure, was much easier to achieve with the banking system, with the corporate sector, etc. And that's, I would say, the part of society that should be easier to agree with. I was really surprised how hard it was for the Macri administration in the second half to get significant agreements from the private sector. I think it's a much more difficult environment to achieve these things.
Very quickly, adding to what Alejandro said, I mean, the Mexican program worked because we had the backing of the union. The unions had a very powerful leader, Don Fidel Velázquez. I mean, he was an iconic, they had the majority. They have a very substantial representation in Congress, all the diputados del sector obrero and so on. And I spent many hours, and the president spent many hours with Don Fidel explaining the situation, and he rallied the base and said, we have to bite the bullet, and which is very, very difficult to conceive in other circumstances, that the labor, actually the big labor unions would support such a drastic adjustment problem, because the alternative we explained to the was to default on the debt. It was to default on the desabonos, and we would have gotten a very chaotic situation, and it would have been over the medium term much worse for the workers. So that was what really the glue that made it possible to pull this off.
We are almost we have run out of time, but I understand that Minister Carvalho wanted to raise a quick point.
Yes. One of the questions was, how will Argentina convince foreign investors to come back to Argentina after so many defaults and expropriations of direct investment? I think that what Argentina has in favor for the future is the huge amount of dollars that Argentina have, not in Argentinian banks, not within the Argentinian economy, but outside. And it is not black money, it's really money that has been declared. That is why the INDEC can compute it and say that is $200 million. I think that if the new authorities are able to open up investment opportunities and removing obstacles that have been created during the last 20 years to invest, many Argentinian may come back. It will not be immediately, but that may provide the financing for the necessary investment and also to to revive the value of the bonds and all that. Now, I want to emphasize that Emilio's idea of dollarization, or even other ideas of removing capital controls and letting the dollar to move freely in and out of the country, and all that is very important to create the conditions for Argentinian savings to come back to Argentina if the government explains what is the plan to not only stabilize but to grow, and entrepreneurship in Argentina is quite abundant. The problem is that under the rules of the game that have been created because of all the government interventions, the lobbies, the closing of the economy, instead of using the entrepreneurship to invest efficiently and to increase productivity, to create new successful companies, Argentina businessmen and entrepreneurs waste their time lobbying and trying to get benefit from concessions of the government and speculation, no?
Thank you very much.
So that will help.
I'm afraid we are out of time. We're already 10 minutes over time. I apologize. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our distinguished panelists, and have a good evening.
Thank you.